Okay, this is Mike Fader, Sirius XM Left 127. Are we actually on here? Yeah? Couldn't tell. And we are here with some interesting guests tonight. We have a couple of things before we go to our first guest. I'm sure a lot of you saw the testimony of Mr. Brennan in front of the his fan club the other day in the Senate. And I have written an essay about Brennan and drones, and it's on my website, which I recommend you read. It's on Fader Files, FEDERFILES.com, FEDERFILES.com. You can go there, check out the essay I wrote on Brennan, and you can get in touch with me, give me some comments if you want, or questions or comments on the essay, and anything else you see on the website. A lot of stuff there, old radio programs I posted, books I've written, essays, other things I do on the radio. All of it's on there on faderfiles.com. Also, we have I have a running kind of parallel political dialogue that goes on to this show and other things I do. And it's a Facebook page called Occupied Territory about every kind of politics, domestic, international, but politics basically. And it's on Facebook. It's called Occupied Territory. You just Google that. All right, so you saw Mr. Brennan testify, or whatever it is that he was doing there, and many of the questions were about torture, obviously, because he was one of the people who was deeply involved in America's torture program, but now he doesn't remember that so well anymore, or he doesn't approve of it, whatever he was saying. But the United States wasn't the only country doing this. Our ally, England, was doing it too, and but it's something that was even more difficult for them to face over there, or even for the government to admit, than it was over here, and that was a pretty tricky thing. There's a brand new book out, which is a very thorough and interesting book on this subject, horrible as it is, called A Secret History of Torture. A Secret History of Torture, and it's by Ian Cobain, and he is with us tonight. Hello. Oh, is he off? We're having trouble contacting Mr. Cobain. So we will talk about Mr. Brennan as the evening goes on, and actually we may start talking about him soon if we can't establish this connection. But this book, A Secret History of Torture, is about, he did a lot of research here, and it's not just that the torture started. He wanted to make sure that the British people understood who they were and what their government did. And it wasn't just that they were involved after 9/11 working with the United States in terms of renditions and their own kind of torture of their own citizens and other people overseas. Also involved in Guantanamo, by the way, but also torture in their history, going back a ways. In fact, it goes back all the way. It go back far enough to when they had an established monarchy or a state. Tell me when the guest is on. Okay, we're having a little trouble reaching him. But of course, torture is as old as human history. I mean, it goes back all the way. I mean, was there ever a time when a king, a monarch, or a dictator didn't torture somebody? Where it becomes difficult or upsetting or problematic, it was always upsetting, but when it becomes something that is at odds with the stated kind of government we have, or that has been established, is when it's supposed to be, when we're living in what is presumably a democracy. So, for instance, when he was writing about England, starting around World War II, which is where this book picks up, actually during World War II, and goes up from there, the way, for instance, the British military and their Secret Service interrogated German prisoners and captured German spies, made them double agents, that kind of thing. And then later on, the way they treated the Germans in occupied Germany. So he basically starts the book from there and works upward through various colonial authorities, the war in, the Irish Rebellion, quote unquote, and all that other kind of stuff. But, obviously, this kind of torture history goes way back in almost every country's history. It's just that when you start talking about democracies where it becomes a problem. Are you there? Have we established this line for you?
I hope so. I'm here.
Okay, so we're getting involved here in our own difficulties technically. But I was just explaining about the history where your book picks up, which is basically during World War II and moves up from there, correct?
That's right, yes.
I was thinking when I was looking at the book that obviously the history of torture, maybe this is something that you sort of drew a line at a certain place, because if you wanted to really examine the history of torture in England, it clearly goes back to the Way back, 1300,
Oh, yeah.
1400, 1500,
Oh, how far back would you want to go? You could go back
Right.
to, you could go back to the Boer War or the Black and Tans in the early 20th century in Ireland. You could go back to India in the 19th century, the Royal Navy in the 18th century.
So you had to draw a line someplace,
I
right?
had to draw a line somewhere, and there was two things that I realised. One is that I realised that the UK was deeply, secretly, but very deeply involved in the rendition programme.
Hmm.
And then separately, I realised that I just came across a couple of references and documents that showed me that the British had been running interrogation centres during the Second World War where people were tortured, and indeed where people were killed. And so I started looking at these two matters entirely separately, and then I decided I'd see if I could draw, I could join the dots between 1940 and 9/11 and 2005, 6, 7.
Now,
There are dots to be joined up.
now you've been a journalist for decades. So what drew you to this? I mean, what brings you to this?
Well, what's really inspired me is the denials by people in government in Britain since 9/11. Whenever you ask them about questions about the UK's involvement in rendition, they always respond by they've always responded by issuing a blanket denial. They won't address the particular allegations or the particular questions, but they deny it. And of course, their denials were false. There was more and more evidence emerged to show that we were involved in rendition to torture, and I was inspired by my desire to cut through those lies, to expose those lies for what they were.
Isn't that the reaction of any? I mean, for instance, if there's a dictatorship or a monarchy in the old-fashioned sense, or maybe in the new-fashioned sense, they don't seem to be too shy about admitting it, or even they just brush it off. Yeah, of course we do it, or why bother to ask? But obviously, the point is, in a democracy, the first thing they're going to do is deny it. It happened in the United States too.
Well, in a repressive regime, they need their people to know that they use torture, because that's one of the means by which they exert control.
Right.
So people say torture doesn't work. Well, it worked really well for Mubarak for 3 decades. So because you can use it to intimidate entire societies. In democracies, of course, where the legitimacy of the state rests upon it rests upon the democratic process, they need to deny that they use it. They need to deny that it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the British used it an awful lot over the years, but we don't use it. But what we're particularly good at, I think, is denying it and concealing it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I found.
It's been a big thing here. I mean, and it carries over this kind of denial or dissociating oneself from the possibility of it, or that we even considered it. It happened even as recently as the other day when John Brennan was being, I don't know what he was, applauded, interviewed, stormed for autographs by the Senate committee. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, they were trying, one of the people there, I presume half of them are lawyers anyhow, was trying to establish that he, once upon a time, believed in torture, used, authorized torture. And he tried to get him to admit that waterboarding was torture, which becomes kind of a symbolic conversation, right? Everything pivots on that sometimes in this country, at least. And he would not say it still. So in other words, there's still that element of denial coming from the very man who was one of the people in charge of the program.
Yes, although 10 years ago there was not so much denial, was there? So we saw these photographs of people in their orange jumpsuits and their blindfolds and their earmuffs being dragged across the ground at Guantanamo. And they were being treated. They were sensory deprivation measures. They weren't security measures. They were sensory deprivation measures to exacerbate the effect of whatever else was happening to them, I would have thought. And that wasn't denied. On the contrary, a Navy photographer was instructed to take photographs, and the photographs were then passed on to AP, and they went all the way around the world. But attitudes have changed in the United States. I get, well, that's the sense I get. You tell me, but
No, it's clear. It's clear that things have changed. I don't know. It's a little bit like that movie Casablanca, where suddenly the press became shocked that gambling was going on in the background. I don't know. I don't understand really generally the cultural and economic and political dynamic of how things change. It's too vast a subject, but it has changed over here. But over in England, is it remained the same or what?
Well, there's the governments tend to be a lot more secretive in the UK than they are in the US.
Really?
Much more secretive. They're most successful in their attempts to conceal evidence of their, if I can put it this way, of their own wrongdoing. But their denials tend to be quite widely believed because I think that the British media tends to be ever so slightly more supine than its US counterparts, certainly the print media. A lot of journalists do tend to look the other way if they see that governments are doing bad things to people that they regard as bad men.
Mm-hmm.
And the British public, since 1945 or thereabouts, has convinced itself that it doesn't do these sort of things, that they belong to a nation that doesn't do torture, that does occupy the moral high ground in some way.
Well, that's certainly the same as this country. I mean, we're the good guys, they were the bad guys. And especially if you look at the Nazis, there's a lot of fuel in the tank to run a country for a long way in its own self-image, right?
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, to your book, though, the book is called The Secret History of Torture. So, especially the word history here, I mean, you drew the line and started with the British government torturing people during World War II. Could you start off with that and explain who that was, who did it, and what was that about?
Right. There were three organisations that were using torture in the UK during World War II. There was the Army, there was the War Office, the Department of Defence, and then there was the Internal Security Organisation, MI5. All of them separately were using torture. The first two were using it initially to try and extract militarily useful intelligence. The second was the MI5 was using it in order to turn Nazi agents. They were very successful at dismantling the Nazis' espionage network in the UK. They were grabbing people as soon as they arrived and treating them in a way that ensured that within a few hours or certainly a few days they were prepared to work for the British,
Mm-hmm.
but never countenance working for the Nazis ever again. The Army's centre, right in the centre of London, in a place called Kensington Palace Gardens, in the very exclusive area where Kensington Palace, which was later to be occupied by Princess Diana. Mm-hmm. They had a row of 19th century villas there, which they turned into an interrogation centre where people were tortured. But by the beginning of 1945, they ceased to be interested in militarily useful information, and they turned it into what they described as a war crimes investigation centre. And people who were going to be prosecuted for war crimes after the war were sent there to be interrogated. But very disturbingly, I would have thought, some of the people who were going to be prosecution witnesses at those war crimes were also sent there. Mm-hmm. So if you had an officer in the Waffen-SS who was accused of a war crime, he would be sent to this place, which was called the London Cage, colloquially, the London Cage.
Mm-hmm.
But then some of his more junior officers or NCOs would go to the same place, and they would be treated in the same way in order to ensure that when they appeared in court as prosecution witnesses, they were prepared to give evidence against their officers.
So they were, if not actually tortured, but possibly tortured, they were certainly threatened with dire consequences if they didn't testify in the right way, right?
Well, no, the man who ran this place wrote his memoirs in 1954, and he submitted it to the War Office to be vetted. And there was absolute pandemonium. He was threatened with prosecution. Everybody who'd actually seen the manuscript was threatened with prosecution and imprisonment. Mm-hmm. And the book was essentially suppressed. But I have now obtained that manuscript, and he boasted about what he did to people. He was quite clear that he was mistreating people in quite appalling fashion.
Now, if you look at things in a historical context, and the same thing happens over here. I mean, these parallels are always very, are very telling. But in this country, for instance, when anybody talks about the way that Nazi SS people or high-level people were treated, or it even laps over into discussions about whether or not the atomic bomb should have been dropped. People look back on this time, and let's just leave it with the Jap. Let's take the Nazis, because we were fighting, the British and the Americans were fighting the same enemy there. Anything went with these people because they were considered, pro forma and actually just plain evil. And they did anything to anybody to do what they wanted. They tortured people. They just plain murdered people. And Britain itself, I mean, for instance, the other day, Brennan said, and then the paper that the president finally released, which gave some guidelines on to the drone strikes, but it sort of topples over into the area of torture. In other words, if there's an imminent threat, if there's what they called an imminent threat, now clearly there was an imminent threat. I mean, look at the bombings during World War II of England, and there was an imminent threat of invasion, then a long way of asking a question of you, and then maybe what your opinion was about history and the British people looking back on it. Maybe people thought, well, look, they did this. They would have done anything. They did do anything. They would have invaded us. They would have murdered us all. We have an absolute right to do that. There was no question.
Well, I would say that torture is understandable rather than justifiable, but certainly it is understandable, and its use is entirely understandable. In the summer of 1940, when the British people really believed that they were about to be invaded, we can see now with hindsight that the Germans probably weren't capable of doing so.
True.
But the people didn't realize that in August, September 1940. We really thought we were about to be invaded. And under those circumstances, then you can understand that you probably want the authorities to use all possible means to protect the nation.
In other words, in British culture and history, that kind of torture is probably not looked upon anyway like it was after 9/11, or it's not generally condemned because of what the threat was, correct?
Well, no, because most British people don't realise it happened. We've been myth since 1945 that we didn't do it, that there were certain battlefield excesses which were regrettable but understandable, but the idea that we systematically tortured a number of our prisoners is not widely understood, because a lot of the documentation relating to it has been suppressed and has only very recently been declassified, but declassified in a quietly, so that it's news. Basically, the idea that we did this is news.
Did some of this come out in the Guardian originally?
It came out. I produced a couple of years ago. I produced some reports about our activities in the Second World War in the Guardian. So I was aware of what some of these organisations did, but not all of them. MI5, until very recently, was insisting that it did not use torture during the Second World War, and of course it did.
So when people hear that now, what is their attitude towards that?
I think a lot of people are shocked and surprised, because we have built up this very British myth, about ourselves that we didn't do this during the Second World War, that we were above all this. Now, we know that we did some awful things during colonial conflicts, and people who are old enough know that there were some awful things perpetrated by the state as well as by the state's opponents in Ireland in the 70s in particular. But during the Second World War, we've got this myth, this sort of cozy myth that somehow, we were just above all that sort of thing,
That's something they do, not something we do.
Exactly. And of course, that's something you have to always do during conflicts, isn't it? To sustain yourself, you have to tell yourself that your enemies are lesser people than you are. The idea that they're just ordinary people who are trying to defend themselves from you is a very difficult idea for people to grasp, particularly during the midst of a conflict.
Well, that's an interesting point you make, because it's always been that way in terms of the kind of, not just the fact that there is warfare against certain groups or countries, but the kind of warfare. Like the United States has always come up with its own probably similar descriptions of other ethnic groups or countries or kinds of people as less than civilized or savages or not human or you name it, right? You know, I mean, even I guess as far as it concerns the Irish too, right?
Oh, absolutely. We convinced ourselves that the IRA were a bunch of thugs and criminals and gangsters, and they were just in it because they were bloodthirsty. And even now, people, they haven't managed to completely change tack, and the British people accept that was a myth that we were telling ourselves in order to sustain ourselves during this difficult conflict. A lot of people still haven't persuaded them, haven't seen the truth, really, even though Good Friday Agreement was, where are we, 15 years ago.
So, and moving up in the history of the book as you lay it out, after World War II, you move on to what, various colonial struggles?
Well, first of all, I look at the early Cold War practices in post-war Germany, where this is interesting, I think, we ran a network of secret prisons across Germany, North Africa and the Middle East, which we concealed from the Red Cross. And the organisation that ran this network had its own small fleet of aircraft, flying people around between these places and tormenting them. And initially they were Nazis, and then by mid-1946 they were communists. Well, for a while there was an overlap, and there was communists and Nazis being held together. So, I explained this to somebody a little while ago in Britain, and they turned around to me and said, "Are you telling me that we invented the rendition program?" And I thought, well, yeah, kind of, So And then we got involved in, as we started retreating from empire, we became involved in some very difficult conflicts in Kenya, Cyprus, and Aden, Palestine before that, Malaya.
And in all those cases, torture was used?
All of those cases, torture was used. All of those cases, torture was used. And there's some interesting documentation which demonstrates what we were doing in relation to Kenya, Cyprus, and Aden, but less so in relation to Malaya and Palestine.
And when I think of the way that the British characterized the Kenyans during that quote-unquote uprising, as far as less than human, and then when you hear about something like this, it just, it's typical that this kind of thing goes on. So obviously, in a colonial situation where people are overseas, anywhere from a couple of hundred to several thousand miles away from England, there is no imminent threat to England.
Well, but there was seen to be a threat to British interests, I suppose, and the British colonial authorities very often felt that they had a right to be in these places, and even when there was an agreement that they would withdraw, they were very rarely withdrawing it quite as quickly as local people wanted to see them go. Mm-hmm. So the British were concerned to keep major bases in the Middle East, for example, and that meant Palestine, then the Suez Canal zone, and as they were being pushed out from one place to another, then it was going to be Cyprus, and then finally it was going to be Aden. In 1962, we were told the people of Aden, or southern Yemen as it is now, we're here to stay. But by 1966, we had to leave. Such was the intensity and the violence that we were facing. Mm-hmm. And we used torture throughout that conflict and other conflicts in our rather desperate attempt to try and understand the nature of our enemy.
So clearly, and again, similarities in the United States. If the government has never admitted it, and no one has ever been prosecuted or tried, and no one's ever been punished, correct?
Well, late last year, the government admitted that it used torture in Kenya in the 1950s, as it faced litigation in the courts in England, and but they battled for a long time, for months and over a year in the courts in England against these litigants, these former Mau Mau fighters. But finally, they admitted that they used torture in Kenya. As in Ireland, interestingly, in 1971. The British government admitted using what they call the 5 techniques, but they denied they amounted to torture, a little bit like people currently denying that waterboarding amounts to torture. But of course it did. Mm-hmm. So there was an admission of sorts in relation to Ireland in 1971, and the British government promised that these 5 techniques, as they were called, would never be used again. But they said.
But this is also partially lawyer linguistics. In other words, if you don't say the actual word, then you may not be liable for criminal or civil damages. You know.
Yes, well, actually, the British were actually found guilty of using torture in Ireland
by the government.
By the European courts.
Oh, by the European court. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then the British battled really hard on appeal to have that finding reduced from one of torture to one merely of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And they succeeded in this, and this was seen as being, in some way, a victory. The British hadn't been found guilty of torture. They'd merely been found guilty of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. But when you know what it was the British were doing to a very small number of prisoners, 14 men, at that time in late 1971, there's no way that the British nowadays would escape a finding of torture, because we were using torture techniques on these people.
Well, in that case, after all, if you're in England and you're sort of part of Europe and you're part of the whole European system, that's one thing. The United States continues to regard European courts as mere irritants. You know.
Yes, I think that partly explains one of the reasons why the British authorities have been so coy and so reluctant to admit their use of torture since 9/11, which is that they know that there are legal consequences. Mm-hmm. Clear breach of European law. This European Convention on Human Rights was put in place after 1945 to stop states from acting in the way in which the Nazis did. And as we know, the Nazis, 1945-46, a lot of them protested, hey, I wasn't breaking German law.
So, that's right, sure.
So we needed to have in place a legal architecture which imposed itself above domestic law. And the British were one of the driving forces behind the establishment of the European Convention. But now the British realise that whenever they do get involved in in the abuse of prisoners, they could be prosecuted under the European Convention. During these colonial conflicts, we argued that the colonies were not subject to European law because they weren't in Europe. And we tried that again recently in relation to Iraq, and the British government tried that, and they've failed because our prisoners in Iraq were subject to European law because they were under European control.
Well, then this is a sort of natural segue into what happened after 9/11. I mean, the British government, this is Blair at the time, of course, and his pal Bush. These people were intimately involved in the United States rendition program, in torturing prisoners. You say, I think you say in the book someplace that they actually were torturing people at Guantanamo and other places, but certainly they were helping the CIA fly people to and from or en route to CIA torture sites. And then up until recent times, and I guess even maybe right now, the British were and are providing information that leads to drone strikes, right?
The British will not say whether or not they are providing information that leads to drone strikes.
Mm-hmm.
But a number of British citizens have been hit by drones, have been killed by drones. I think it's difficult to imagine that there wouldn't be any British involvement at all in the targeting of these people. There must be some sort of intelligence being passing between the two states.
So get to the point of, let's say, it's 9/11, right? I mean, we're in the very modern era here. Was there, because once that started here in this country, I mean, there was a small, usually it's always this way, a small minority of people who objected. They knew about this and objected to it and tried to bring it to the public's attention. But, of course, they were just ignored because we had a patriotic war against the evil terrorists. Is that a similar thing to what happened after 9/11 there?
I think the realization that the British were involved in it was slower, quite slow. It was 2004-05 before we started to see signs of the British actively supporting the CIA's rendition program. Mm-hmm. What we'd seen before that was evidence of British nationals finding themselves in Guantanamo, and the British government kind of pretended that they were powerless to prevent the United States from removing these people from Afghanistan to Guantanamo. And we can now see, because of the documentation that's emerged, that actually the British decided that they wanted British citizens to go to Guantanamo. They didn't want them coming back to Britain. They didn't know what to do with them. They weren't sure that they would be able to successfully prosecute these people in the UK courts. And so they basically told the United States authorities, you can have them, you can take them to Guantanamo. Once they'd gone to Guantanamo, then British intelligence officers went and questioned them, knowing that they were suffering really quite harsh treatment at Guantanamo, and went and interrogated them after and between these sessions in which they were being mistreated. But whenever they were asked, whenever government ministers were asked about this publicly, they just denied that there was any British involvement in this. They described it as one government minister, the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, said it was all a conspiracy theory, the idea that the British were involved in rendition. Mm-hmm. Some of the documents which I've since obtained show that Jack Straw was signing telegrams saying that he wanted people to be consigned to Guantanamo. He personally was authorizing acts of rendition.
But can you tell us who? There's one pick out one. Sometimes when you talk about one person, it gets a lot more personal, a lot more profound and affecting. Who is Binyam Mohammed?
Binyam Mohammed's an Ethiopian who was a resident in the United States and then the United Kingdom. He settled in the United Kingdom when he was a young man, a teenager, and went to school in the United Kingdom. Then he went off to Afghanistan, and was without a doubt a jihadist, and without a doubt was associated with Al Qaeda. How dangerous he was or wasn't, it's very difficult to say, because his supporters insist that he was, he's largely innocent, and the authorities insist he's an incredibly dangerous individual who's plotting a dirty bomb plot against the United States. We'll probably never know the truth, because instead of Binyam Mohammed being properly investigated and prosecuted, he was instead detained in Karachi as he tried to get out of Pakistan, tortured, questioned by CIA and MI5 officers, then flown to Morocco and suffered the most appalling torture, before then being taken to Afghanistan and a little bit more torture, and off to Guantanamo, by which time more or less any sort of interesting information had been squeezed out of him. And he became something of a celebrated cause in the UK because his lawyers, both American and British lawyers, started litigating on his behalf in the UK courts to try and persuade the British government to disclose what they knew about his torture at the time when they were sending intelligence officers to interrogate him.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually it became clear that MI5 were interrogating him, knowing he was being tortured. They didn't participate. That's not been the British way since 9/11. They're not in the room when these things are happening. They submit questions to those people who are carrying out the abuses, and they go and interrogate people after the abuses have temporarily ended. But the British was determined, absolutely determined, that the court should not disclose what MI5 knew was happening to Binyam Mohammed before one of its officers interrogated him. And there was a long battle, and it went on for months and over a year, in fact. And eventually the courts ordered the disclosure of this information. At that point, we could see that Binyam Mohammed's allegations were true. He was being tortured and being questioned by British intelligence officers after being tortured.
Now, ultimately, what was his fate?
Well, he spent a long time in Guantanamo, and eventually the United States authorities released him and permitted him to travel back to the UK. He hasn't been prosecuted. It's inconceivable he would be prosecuted because the courts in the UK would not permit the prosecution of somebody who's been through years, 8, 9 years of detention without trial and tortured, very obviously tortured. He bears the scars quite literally.
Did they settle with him? Did they make some kind of settlement with him?
Absolutely. He and a number of other British nationals and residents who'd been detained in Guantanamo all sued the government. The government settled at a court, paid them substantial amounts of money. One of the reasons why they did so is to prevent the disclosure of documentation showing just how deeply involved in rendition the British government had been. As the case was rumbling through the courts, more and more documents were being disclosed to the court and then disclosed to the public, which showed the truth of the allegations of British involvement in rendition, including rendition to torture.
Let me ask you a question about something you said earlier when we first started talking. And if you just tuned in, you're listening to Ian Cobain, Cobain. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay, Ian Cobain. And the book just out is called A Secret History of Torture, and parallels what goes on in this country very closely, obviously. But you said during World War II, they were very successful in turning the Nazi agents around, and there's an implication there, if not an outright comment by you, that the torture was effective. Is that true, do you think?
Well, I think you have to bear in mind that torture is used for yes, it can be. Certainly it can be true. But it's used for a variety of reasons. People assume that it's used just to extract information from individuals. And it's not. The British have used it time and time again to, as they would put it during the Second World War, to secure the transfer of loyalties. So you take somebody who's working for your enemy and you ensure that after 36 hours, 48 hours, they're never going to work for your enemy again and they're always going to do what you tell them to do. And there's been an element of that since 9/11. I am absolutely certain of that the British have become involved in abusive interrogations, not to extract information, but to put the fear of God into an individual or a group of individuals, and to ensure that some people are prepared to start working for the British government.
But what guarantees is that could you ever get? I mean, to ensure that, but what's to stop them from ultimately going back where they were?
I guess you keep a very close eye on them. You keep a very close eye on them, and you make sure they're absolutely terrified of being tortured again. But yes, it's a difficult game, isn't it? It's a difficult game, but I know that it's been used in Bangladesh, for example. Dual British Bangladeshi nationals will be tortured, then they'll be questioned after torture sessions by intelligence officers.
Well,
who will then set them loose with a mobile phone, a bit of cash. And, you'll keep in touch with us through this mobile phone, and this is what we want you to do.
I guess there's always a threat, which is something you associate, let's say, with the East Germans or somebody else, or the Nazis, which is that, you don't forget, we know where you live, you have a family, that kind of thing, too.
Oh, well, in the case of Bangladesh, what they simply did was took their passports away from them. And so, you're not leaving Bangladesh now because you're travelling on a British passport. We've got it. You're not going anywhere.
Do you think that there's ever a justification for this? I mean, forget about the moral justification. It's almost like a separate argument. I don't know if it is, but it seems like a separate argument. Do you think there's actually a tactical or strategic or military exception when torture would be the right thing to do if you have a serious enemy?
I can certainly see the utility of it. I'm not one of these people who thinks it doesn't work. It is a means of, you can use it to intimidate, you can use it to secure people's allegiance to a point, you can use it to extract some information. You can also use it, and this is the way we used it in Ireland in the 70s, to extract a sort of a supposed confession that can then be put forward before a court, which will ensure that your enemy is in jail for 25 or 30 years.
Well, I guess that's the part that's always the weakest part of the weakest link in the argument of the effectiveness of it is that since the time of witches, and you go all the way back, I mean, if you torture somebody, they're going to tell you what you want to hear. It doesn't necessarily guarantee. I mean, in the United States courts, generally speaking, although lately, who knows anymore, any kind of, like, for instance, even in the police in New York City where we were here, anything that was obtained by abuse or torture was considered inadmissible in a court.
Yes, but in Ireland, and it is incumbent upon the defendant to prove that the confession had been extracted through the use of force, and if there were no marks.
Oh well, it's the same thing here.
Careful not to leave marks.
Same thing here with the New York City Police Department. They went to some extraordinary lengths to make sure that nothing was visible. You know?
Yes, exactly. In fact, I know a number of people who were involved in this process, both sides, both on giving and receiving this mistreatment. And what you'd have officers who were inflicting the beatings, and a more senior officer would be responsible for keeping them on a tight leash and making sure that they didn't end up in hospital. So that's the way it worked in Ireland in the 70s. But I think there's another point which is worth making, which you talked about, whether it works or not, whether it's worthwhile, whether it has a value, which is that I don't think it ever has just one consequence. I think if you torture an individual, you can't be sure that it won't have several consequences. And I'm thinking again of Ireland. There's people I know who were members of the IRA, who were responsible for killings, responsible for spreading a huge amount of fear and distress and grief, and were eventually detained. And confessions were extracted from them, and they were put before the courts, and they were sent to jail. And there's one chap in particular I know who was sent to jail for life, and he eventually did 16 years, and he left the IRA after 10 years, and he was still a prisoner for another 6. He went to his commanding officer in prison and said, "I've had enough of this, I don't think it's working." And when he came out, he became a journalist, and he's now a very useful member of society, a very peaceful member of society. But he made the point to me that the use of torture against him and his neighbours and his friends created what he describes as a reservoir of hatred, which isn't going to run dry for generations. People are going to be drinking from. And he makes the point that there are Irish children who are not yet born who hate the British and hate the British state because of what happened to people like him.
Well, this is the argument about torture here, and also the incessant, relentless, ever-increasing drone program. You know, I mean, people would look at it from a cost-effectiveness point of view, but that's how we got in trouble in Vietnam. But the idea is that yes, you're killing off certain people who are sworn enemies and proven enemies of your country. But what are the other consequences, as you've just mentioned, that will come from it in a ripple effect across a country and through generations? You know.
Yes, and I guess the lesson is that if you're fighting an enemy, whether they be terrorists or more an insurgent or more conventional, well, certainly a terrorist or insurgency, you have to try and avoid doing anything which unnecessarily exacerbates the causes of the conflict. And that's a lesson that the British learned very slowly and painfully in Ireland. And I get the impression that after 9/11, we unlearned it. We unlearned it very quickly. And we started doing things which actually made matters worse. So, and I guess it's clear to me that the Obama administration has seen that the drone program can make matters worse. There was a very good series of articles in the Washington Post in October in which talked about Obama advisors realizing the drone program is getting out of hand in Pakistan. There was talk of senior Pakistani military having stand-up rows with their American counterparts.
Well, I mean, I pay close attention to these things, doing what I do here, and I read all these articles and hear people's testimony. If it's getting out of hand, I'm not really aware of the fact that they're aware of that. I mean, it's because they're increasing their drone attacks all the time.
They're increasing. I thought the idea was that they were going to embed them and make sure that it goes on for a long period of time in perpetuity, but possibly a little bit more judiciously. Not quite so many, but maybe I'm a long way away. So.
I think that's really what they say that they think people need to hear, but they are proceeding full speed ahead. One last question. I'm sorry to keep you so long. Do some people over in your country consider you unpatriotic for doing this?
No. There's probably people in my family who consider
there you go.
There may be people in this house that I'm in now.
All right. Just make sure the door's closed.
Yeah. No, of course there are. Of course there are. But look, and they say, you're taking too much interest in these bloody terrorists. But I say, my work isn't about the terrorists. It's about the state. Seeing the way that the state reacts when it sees itself to be under threat.
See, I'm glad you put it that way, because to me, I see this kind of questioning of our behavior, of our government's behavior, or our culture's behavior as patriotism, just the opposite of what other people claim I might be doing.
Yes. I mean, what part of it, of a journalist's responsibility is it to look the other way if they see that their government are committing crimes, their government is torturing people? Why should a journalist look the other way? And some do, of course.
Oh, sure.
No, our job is to find out more.
All right. Well, listen, I appreciate your sticking around for so long. It's later over there than it is over here, obviously. A Secret History of Torture, Ian Cobain. And obviously it's available, as everything is these days. It's from Counterpoint Press, published in communist Berkeley. So I don't know. Was there no publisher over there?
Oh, yes, there's a publisher over here.
Okay, I know.
It's a title in the UK as well. It's called... the book's called Cruel Britannia in the UK.
Cruel Britannia. That's right. It's reviewed that way. All right. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Mike.
Okay. We're going to take a break right now. Torture. I mean, that is a big controversy about this film Zero Dark 30, about which it's been nominated for Academy Awards. Apparently, it's an extremely good movie as a movie, but there's a tremendous argument going on. I can't really get involved in it too much because I didn't see the movie. And by the way, you know what? I'm not going to see the movie. I really don't want to watch people getting tortured. Even if it is a good movie artistically, or if it's an action movie that's really exciting, or if it's making some kind of political point, I don't want to see it. That's just a personal point of view. But there's this constant argument. Is it worth the trouble? Is it the right thing to do? Should we be doing it? Is torture something that works? Is it something that we should be doing to an enemy, which is, let's say, implacable, that will destroy us any chance they get? How close are they to doing this? This is a big argument that goes back and forth, and it was brought up many times in the hearings the other day with this extraordinary character, John Brennan, who made me very ill to even look at and listen to. Anyhow, we're going to take a break, and if you want to call up about this and give me your opinion, feel free. 866-997-4748. There are extra points for calling. Okay, we're back. This is Mike Fader on that very same place that the announcer man said, Sirius XM Left 127, your home for left-wing, radical, terrorist, communist politics. And here we are. So I presume a lot of you, we're going to do, at 7 o'clock, we're going to take a lot of calls on, presumably, if people call, on the John Brennan's hearings. You know, Mr. Brennan has been proposed by Mr. Obama to be the head of the CIA. I guess he's already this sort of, spiritual advisor to the CIA. But he worked in the CIA for a long time. That's where he comes from. So now he'll scurry back there, through the basement or whatever he does, and become maybe the head of the CIA. Obviously, he will be the head of the CIA because these old, saggy-ass, ass-kissing sycophants, except for one or two people on the Senate committee, were practically kissing him and asking for his autograph. So I'm guessing that the man will be approved. They had an opportunity to ask him questions. Sometimes I wish when I look at these hearings, and I only do that very infrequently because I know what they're going to be like. I mean, basically, it's a scripted circus. And if you want to read a sort of longer essay I have on this, go to my website. It's called Fader Files, FEDERFILES.com, and read the latest essay. I posted it this afternoon on this whole issue. And you can get in touch with me by going there too, to Fader Files. There's a contact and join the mailing list too. But clearly he will be approved. And it's just a sad, silly circus with all these people who are all buddies really with each other. There was only one guy, Senator Wyden, Ron Wyden of, I don't know where he's from. Where is he from? Oregon, someplace out west, who asked him some serious questions and actually got a little harsh with the guy. And even still, everybody was thanking him for his service, which fascinates me. They're thanking him for his service to his country. Well, I suppose you could call that. The man is working for the CIA. It's a government agency. He is theoretically fighting, or maybe actually in some cases fighting, our sworn enemies. He is certainly killing a lot of them, including a lot of civilians as collateral damage, which theoretically, by the way, he said he agonized over it. That's one of the things that really twisted my guts with this motherfucker. He said, here's a guy who meets every Tuesday with the president and advises him who to kill overseas. And he's a very intelligent man, had, as he pointed out, a Jesuit education, which is to say, what he means by that, and what other people mean by that, is that there was a serious examination of the morality, the intellectual approach, but also the morality of your behavior in the world towards other people. What is moral? I suppose you might always say, they just relate that to what's religious, but what's moral? And he said that he agonized over every one of these decisions. I wonder if his agony is the same as the agony of the family and the friends and the school pals and the people in the villages of the people that he blew up. Now, I'm sort of, and this is a complicated issue, and when we talk about this at 7 o'clock, I want to get a lot of opinions about this because it's a very complicated issue, right? So they're thanking for he agonized over this. This guy agonized over the fact that that every single time he blows somebody up or disintegrates them or destroys them, including people who are in wedding parties, children, people who crossed the village square accidentally when he was after a bad guy, or whoever he decided was a bad guy, he agonized over it. I don't think his agony is exactly the same as the people who got blown up and their relatives and their friends and people who knew them. So he just disgusted me. The man completely disgusted me. But we will talk more about him after the 7 o'clock news. Meanwhile, he will be approved. And but the issue of drone strikes, so I've been talking about this for years on this program. Some of you who go back far enough may remember that I interviewed an Air Force major who operated out of a base in the suburbs, but off of like 20, 30 miles out of Las Vegas. And he went there every day to like a 9-to-5 job and sat down, he had his, he left the wife and the kids in the morning and he went there and he sat down at his console in this Air Force base, which was underneath a mountain somewhere. And based on intelligence that he got from overseas and surveillance cameras from drones and from satellites, he blew people up and killed them from his console. He was playing a video game, only real people died. And basically, when he was on the air with me, he assumed a purely military, neutral, almost monotonous, that is, say, monotonal point of view about it. He kept instead, and cops always do this, especially the CIA and the military always do this. He kept referring to people as individuals. Yes, an individual or the target. He said he never call people because he can't. If he started calling people like Brennan, if he started calling people, if he started saying men, women, and children or people, then he couldn't handle it, presumably. And that's what they all do. They say an individual was targeted and he was eliminated. And they don't ever use the word kill. They use the word kill, although Brennan apparently and the president have a kill list. So maybe they're getting more comfortable with doing it, actually. It's not bothering them so much anymore. But still, maybe it's a good sign that the remnants, the leftovers of some sense of morality and a question of right and wrong exists in the minds, and I don't know what's left of the hearts of these people like Brennan and this Air Force major, because they never refer to, they go to the trouble of referring to children and men and women that they murder, and they call them eliminating a target, or an individual was targeted. This is what they do. Meanwhile, there's Brennan, who's going to be clearly proclaimed to be the head of the CIA. And is that the reward we give to a guy who essentially has killed close to 1,000 innocent, not personally, but he's involved in this he goes all the way back to Bush, this guy. He was involved in the CIA. He helped come up with this whole drone plan all the way back in the Bush era. So he just continued it and was promoted even and given more responsibilities and more accolades under Obama. He's Obama's consigliere. He's his war consigliere. He advises him who to kill. Then he goes home to the wife and kids, or the wife. He's older now. His kids are probably grown. I find it repellent, almost beyond words. Did anybody else see this guy? We'll talk about it after 7 o'clock. Meanwhile, join us again after the 6 o'clock news here on the Mike Fader Show, when we will talk to a man who is a theologian, a Catholic theologian, about why it is that a lot of people who are very much against abortion don't seem to mind guns being used to murder everybody. In other words, there's a whole lot of people in this country, and in his case, he's concerned about Catholics and Christians, who are against abortion because it's so awful, but they don't want any gun control, even though these guns are used to murder children, like in Newtown, Connecticut. So this will be a conversation we'll have after 6 o'clock, and join us then. Until then, we will have a little music to go out with, and we'll be back after the 6 o'clock news.
All the world over so easy to see. People everywhere just wanna be free. Listen, please, listen, that's the way it should be. Peace in the valley.
And this is Mike Fader. We're back again. Not too long ago, I think it was like roughly a couple of weeks ago, there was something called the March for Life in Washington. And I'll read you the article from the front page in the New York Times here. It says, the March for Life in Washington this Friday renewed the annual impassioned call to end legalized abortion, 40 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. But this year, some Roman Catholic leaders and theologians are asking why so many of those who call themselves, quote, pro-life, end quote, have been silent or even opposed when it comes to controlling the guns that have been used to kill and injure millions of Americans. More than 60 Catholic priests, nuns, scholars, and 2 former ambassadors to the Vatican sent a letter this week saying that if marchers and politicians truly want to defend life, they should support common sense reforms to address the epidemic of gun violence in our nation. And skipping down in this article, it says here, one of the theologians, a theologian who signed the letter, Tobias Winwright, an associate professor of theological ethics at St. Louis University, a Catholic institution, said that Pope John Paul II promoted the notion of a culture of life that encompassed opposition to abortion as well as euthanasia and the death penalty. Professor Winwright, a former law enforcement officer, said he was encouraged when the Vatican spokesman, the Reverend Federico Lombardi, recently praised American religious leaders and the Obama administration for proposals to limit guns. And we have Professor Winwright with us tonight. Hi.
Hello there.
Let me give people a little bit of your background here, and we can move ahead with this article and this whole subject here. Tobias Winwright, he's an associate professor of theological ethics, Department of Theological Studies, and director of the, is it Manresa? Is that how you say it?
Manresa, yeah.
Manresa program in Catholic Jesuit Studies at St. Louis University, and this is in St. Louis, Missouri. Written some books, After the Smoke Clears, The Just War Tradition and Post-War Justice, A Green Discipleship, Catholic Theological Ethics and the Environment, let's see, co-editor, Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, and book reviews editor, Political Theology. So you signed this letter. Why did you feel that you needed to sign this letter or join these people?
Well, there's a number of us Catholic theologians around the country who belong to, we kind of email each other and stay in touch and about various things going on in the country, and every now and then we formulate some sort of a statement. And given what happened at Sandy Hook, with all those children and their teachers being massacred, as well as other recent mass murders over the last couple of years, we just felt like it was time to speak out about how gun violence is actually a life issue, and our bishops, as well as the Vatican, have spoken about that at times, but most Americans and most American Catholics aren't aware about the Church's teachings on gun violence as much as they are aware about other issues of life, such as abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the background to this statement, and why I felt compelled to sign on to it.
I think I read a graph somewhere or a chart that said when they measured, I don't know how they would possibly do a thing like this, but that they sort of they took a poll, or they measured the responses of different of Catholics, Baptists, fundamentalist Christians, different branches of Christianity toward this issue, compared to, like, opposing abortion and also opposing gun control. Catholics were, I don't know what the word would be, but they weren't as many Catholics involved in this contradiction as there were, let's say, fundamentalist Christians.
Right. I read somewhere, too, that Catholics are, on this issue, more supportive of gun legislation that will hopefully help to reduce the likelihood of gun shootings and mass murders like Sandy Hook, that Catholics are a little bit more in favor of such legislation, in contrast to other pro-life Christians, especially the more evangelical or fundamentalist Protestant Christians. So the percentages, I can't find them, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but they're pretty notable.
Yeah, they were significant, as I remember. So, but part of that could be, I mean, you'd have to sort of break that down and figure out where people live, or who they are, where they come from. Probably there are more Catholics in urban settings, for instance, or northern settings, or northern Midwestern settings, than there are, for instance, down south. So you have to factor things into that, right?
Probably so, and also theologically speaking, the Catholic social tradition it views government in a little bit more positive light than other theological traditions and pretty much America for the most part. So Catholic social teaching, yes, government should protect people, and it shouldn't be too big, but it has a positive role, and legislation about education and healthcare, all that. Catholic tradition views that as one of the roles of government, whereas maybe some of the more fundamentalist evangelical Protestant groups would be more wary of government, or see it as even more of a threat.
Do you think that one of the possibilities there is, or one of the reasons for this, is the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church as opposed to other groups?
Well,
I don't want to get you in hot water, by the way. You know what I mean? But I'm just wondering out loud.
Right. I'd have to know more what you mean there. Yeah, the Catholic tradition is more hierarchical with the bishops and the Vatican.
Well, what I mean specifically is to tend to receive in a more accommodating or a receptive manner things from above, or things that an authority will communicate, as opposed to other groups.
Right. Catholics are supposed to inform our consciences to the best of our ability. And so, yes, the magisterium, which, is the Pope and the bishops, they issue statements that they don't want Catholics to simply say, the church is opposed to this or for that, but they actually issue statements that they hope the Catholics will read and inform themselves, and be persuaded, not just because it's given by an authority, but be persuaded by the argument. So, yeah, but given what you've said, it does help to be able to. In our statement, we quoted the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which issued a statement in 2000, 13 years ago, Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration: A Catholic Perspective on Crime and Criminal Justice. And in that statement, they talked about we need measures that control the sale and use of firearms, and we need sensible regulations on handguns. And it is, we can quote such things, but at the same time, arguments by authority, they're not always the best arguments. And,
well, sure.
So,
yeah.
so the statistics and as well as other elements, hopefully, are persuasive to people of reason and goodwill.
You say in mentioning in the article here that Pope John Paul II promoted the notion of a culture of life that encompassed opposition to abortion as well as euthanasia and the death penalty. In other words, the bottom line here is that if you're against any kind of unnatural killing of life, unnatural termination of life in any form, then you should be against it across the board. There shouldn't be exceptions, correct?
Right, and the American Cardinal Bernardin, who's now deceased, he was known for this seamless garment argument, the consistent ethic of life, and that's kind of gotten some traction in Catholic circles as well as Protestant circles over the last few decades. And Pope John Paul II did not use that term exactly, but in his major encyclical from 1995, Evangelium Vitae, he did address all these issues and said, abortion, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, death penalty, these are actually expressions of a culture of death. And Catholics and Christians and other people of goodwill should be peacemakers, and we should be promoting and building cultures of life.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as far as I can recall, guns were not mentioned in that particular encyclical, but I think, in fact, Bishop Blair, Stephen Blair, he did state concerning the administration's take on this issue, the bishops hope that the steps taken by the administration will help build a culture of life.
Well, certainly the way that the children died at Sandy Hook and the way that people generally die if they're shot is not a natural death, correct?
Correct. Obviously a weapon did it, held by a person. Often the person, has mental illness or is angry or just intent really on murdering. But yes, these children, and that brings up another issue for me. Some Catholics will try to say, well, abortion is the main issue because innocents are the victims.
Mm-hmm.
And death penalty, on the other hand, that's not as important because the person that's executed is guilty.
So they make a moral distinction, right?
Right, they make a moral distinction there. The official teaching of the Catholic Church is, though, that all lives are sacred. And Pope John Paul II said not even a murderer loses their inherent dignity as a human person. That's a lot different than what Thomas Aquinas said in the 13th century. He compared murderers to beasts. So John Paul II really kind of pushed the envelope to include even the guilty have this intrinsic inherent dignity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even if we want to say, well, even so, death penalty is a little bit different than abortion, the victims of these shootings, like at Sandy Hook, but even, goodness gracious, in Chicago or in other major cities,
sure,
all the children of, especially poor children and children of color who are dying every month due to not mass shootings, but, to gun shootings every day, these add up, and these are innocent children as well.
But so let me ask you about this based on these, you can take any argument or any point of view, moral, political, or economic, and extend it, way out, like it's on a continuum, right? But I'll ask you, based on what you just said and what you're quoting here as a stand and a way of looking at life, is there any reason why anybody at all should ever have a gun unless they're a police officer or somebody who is legally entitled to protect themselves for some extraordinary reason? Is there any reason at all?
Well, the Catholic position, pretty much, according to that statement from the bishops that I said mentioned, from 12 years ago, as well as there's the Vatican representative on peace and disarmament. I can't recall his name right now, but he even spoke about this, that ultimately from a Catholic perspective, we should be striving to create a society where there would be no need for everyone to be armed, or for most people to be armed. That police and the military should pretty much be the only ones who are armed in order to protect. Because things will never be perfect. There will always be some evil people that do evil things, and there is a need for force at some point. But that there's a right that everyone should be armed. There are some Catholics right now who are actually questioning that and saying that, ultimately in the world today, that we should not. That actually having everybody armed might create more problems than solutions.
Have you ever had these arguments with people which generally tend to go nowhere and nobody learns anything particularly, where people who are ardent gun enthusiasts and passionately opposed to the slightest control of guns in any way? Have you ever had an argument with somebody who's a Catholic on this issue?
I really haven't, because this issue, I think, is just now starting to get the attention in public. And I've had debates with Catholics on other issues such as death penalty or war. So this is kind of probably similar to those, but no. On Facebook, obviously, people will raise questions, or there's some blogs that I'm involved with where people on the comment sections tried to raise a lot of questions, but not in the classroom or not in a parish when I'm speaking. This, however, hasn't really been a topic that I've spoken on per se.
Well, it's a sure way to ignite a provocative discussion, as I well know from being on the air here. But let me extend this a little bit. One of the book titles here I notice is The Just War Tradition, right? Yeah. Now, obviously, I haven't read the book, but is there, if you're a follower of Christ, turn the other cheek, right? Render unto Caesar's. But basically, maybe one of the most famous figures in the world, maybe the most famous figure in the world, next to people like Gandhi and everybody else, nonviolence, no matter what. In other words, you don't kill people. I guess the basic assumption is that the Lord gives life, right? If you believe this, and only the Lord could take it away. Something like that. But turning the other cheek, when people think of nonviolence, look at Martin Luther King, patterns himself after Gandhi and Jesus. Is there any circumstance what is a just war? Is there any circumstance at all when somebody who believes in Christ and his teachings could justify any sort of killing, even in self-defense? Right.
There's a whole 2,000-year debate about that within Christianity.
Well, let's wrap it up tonight. Let's get to the bottom.
That would be nice.
Okay.
The earliest Christians were pacifists, most of them, and that was the norm, like Jesus. And they were nonviolent, and they would not serve in the military, and they would not serve in any way that might involve killing. So, when Christianity became a legitimate, accepted part of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and you had bishops like Ambrose and Augustine, they started to say, well, now we have Christians who are in the military. Can they be in the military or not? And their argument was, yes, but under certain conditions. They should only be able to kill out of love to protect the innocent.
Kill out of love?
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
They're supposed to mourn that you had to kill it all. So you tried not to have to kill it all, but it was a mournful experience, not something to celebrate. And you love both your enemy and your neighbor. They're both your neighbors. You love them both, but the innocent person, that your love for them forces you, and what the enemy neighbor is doing forces your hand, and and if the only way you can defend the innocent is by killing them, that is regrettable, that is mournful, but it's justified.
That's fascinating to me in terms of absolutely current events. Did you see Mr. Brennan testify the other day?
I didn't see it. I've seen highlights of it, but I am also working on that issue of drones as well.
Well, that's something we can talk about. But apropos of what you just said, he mentioned specifically that he had received a Jesuit education.
Fordham University, yes.
Correct. And that he agonized, that's his word, over every one of these drone strikes.
And that's good that he is agonizing about that. That is the spirit of the just war tradition. And it's not a culture that celebrates killing or celebrates militarism or celebrates even guns. And that's going back to the gun issue. In America, we kind of have a glorification of the gun.
And the military.
Yeah, as well. And so that's really, there's a lot of inertia there, and so there's a lot of work to be done to try to counter that. And for Christians and Catholics in America, we have to really think about, well, like you said, Jesus. I mean, what did he teach? What did he do? And even though the tradition later on began to allow for the use of lethal force, it should only be a last resort. It's got to be truly justified to defend the innocent. It should be proportionate force. It shouldn't be overwhelming, disproportionate. It should be discriminating, so you're not harming non-combatants intentionally. There's many elements to the just war tradition that have become ingrained in international law as well as in our own military training. I mean, these are elements of the laws of war. Or even when I was in law enforcement, my use of force had to be justified. It had to be last resort. It had to be proportionate. All those kinds of things. And Christians need to recover that sense of, even if force is justified, it's a regrettable thing, and it should be limited. It should be restrained, and it should only be used when it's necessary.
Well, this is what Mr. Brennan has said repeatedly over and over again in other interviews and when people could catch him for public statements, and certainly in his hearings the other day. Sometimes I just wonder, though, when somebody gets to the point where they agonize over everything, let's say he agonized over every one of these strikes, then after you get up to 700 people, 800 people, and 1,000 people who are clearly documented as civilians who were blown up, connected to his authority and his outright just pressing a button practically, isn't there a certain point beyond which the agony becomes suspect?
Right. The thing is, he is using that language, and so that we can, the just war language, so those who subscribe to that approach, the Catholic Church tradition, as well as other Christians, as well as pretty much our country. Obama, in his Nobel speech in Oslo, he mentioned the just war tradition and how basically that is our framework, our moral framework for the use of force. Given that they say that, we can hopefully try to hold them accountable to that. And at some point, as the civilian deaths, their numbers rise, although Brennan says actually now we're doing better with these and not as many civilians are being killed.
Well, that's per drone strike. He says that fewer people are being killed per drone strike.
Right.
However, there are far more drone strikes.
Yes,
Yeah.
and as these over time add up, then we've got this issue of proportionality. If the evils associated with going to war or particular use of force outweigh the actual benefits that we're supposedly trying to achieve, then at some point you have to say, okay, it's no longer justified. So the Catholic bishops in the early 70s, they actually, during the Vietnam War, they were worried about it during the whole time, but in the early 70s they finally said, that the evils associated with this war now outweigh the very evils that we were trying to stop in the first place. And this war needs to be stopped.
Well, that and I remember that very well, being of that generation, except, of course, for our beloved exception to that rule, Cardinal Spellman in New York City, who was perfectly happy to be blessing anybody who was killing anybody.
Right.
Yeah, he was a standout. But so this just war thing fascinates me. I mean, for instance, you were in law enforcement, right?
Yes, I was in corrections initially, and then I did some policing later on, yes.
And where was this, out in the Midwest somewhere?
Actually, I was in Florida for my initial 4 years as a corrections officer, and then in Iowa, in Des Moines, when I did some policing.
And at that time, was your point of view on these kinds of things less evolved, or have you changed since then?
Well, yeah, there's a trajectory. The first stint was while I was actually an undergraduate at the University of South Florida, and I worked full time, midnight shift mostly, while I went to school full time during the day, and you know I was so young then, and there was a big disconnect between what I was doing in the classroom and what I was experiencing in the you know at work.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, you know, with more education, more experience, both you know professionally out there as well as in the classroom, yeah, my views have, and they continue to develop. I continue to try to inform my conscience and inform myself to the best I can, and every now and then I have to, you know, change or modify something a little bit because I stand corrected.
Do you find yourself getting more to be more of a pacifist as you get older?
I actually studied with two of the most prominent pacifists of the past century, John Howard Yoder, a Mennonite at Notre Dame, and Stanley Hauerwas at Duke, a Methodist theologian. And I, you know, that this is why I actually do what I do, because given my experience in law enforcement, I wrestled with issues of force and could I, as a Christian in good conscience, use force? And so once I graduated from undergrad and I went on to graduate school, that became my primary area of interest, and that's what I wrote my dissertation about at Notre Dame.
But I'm sorry, do you mind if how old are you now?
I'm 47.
47. I find that myself, and maybe this is the nature of young men and older men. I don't know. When you're younger, you know, all these hormones, and then you tend to, because you don't have the education or the experience, you fall for the patriotic fervor of whatever the particular war is at the time. And a perfect example of this is Born on the 4th of July, Ron Kovic's book.
Right.
You know, and the movie that was made from it. That's why young men are always, you know, jumping up and, you know, volunteering to go off and get the evil people, fill in the blank, whoever they are, who are threatening our way of life, et cetera, et cetera. But when you get older and you see more and more of this, I mean, I was a probation officer for a long time too. And the older I get, for instance, I was just talking earlier about this movie, Zero Dark 30.
I haven't seen it yet, but I know about it.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to see it, you know, and I was always a big war movie fan, you know, especially when I was younger. And who knows what the psychological reasons are why a lot of men like to watch war movies, but I don't like to watch them so much anymore.
I don't either.
And I find violence more and more difficult to even look at, let alone read about. I guess I'm more squeamish, that's one word for it, or less tolerant of the use of force. But I'm certainly not going to go see this movie because I hear that, A, there are graphic scenes of torture. Just personally, I can't watch it.
Right.
And B, that it justifies the use of torture. And so this is a long way of asking you another question, is how does torture relate to all this point of view that you're talking about?
Well, actually, torture is one of those items that's considered intrinsically evil, to use a technical phrase in the Catholic tradition, and it's never justified, regardless of the consequences, regardless of one's motives, just like abortion.
I guess the Inquisition missed that memo,
huh? Right. I mean, same with slavery. It's intrinsically evil, but for a long time, Catholics owned slaves too. So there's developments, and so the list of intrinsically evil actions in the Catholic tradition includes things. When I put it on the board, and there's multiple items, there's things that students are just amazed because they tend to think of a handful of things at best, and usually it's abortion. But and just because something's intrinsically evil doesn't mean that it's all equally evil either. Because
so things have different weights and values.
Yeah, because intentionally lying to someone is intrinsically evil. Masturbation is intrinsically evil. Contraception is intrinsically evil. And so you wouldn't say, or most Catholics, I hope, wouldn't say that an act of contraception is the same level of evil as torture or abortion.
Well, there are
intrinsically evil.
There are Christians who do say that.
There probably are, but most moral theologians would say that's not how the tradition understands these things. That although they are intrinsically evil, that does not mean that they are all equally evil.
What does evil mean?
Well, I mean,
I know I sound like one of your students, right?
Right,
but,
right. Augustine said it was the absence of good. But there's debate on that too. Does it really have being? Does it really exist?
Well, what do you think it is? If you do think it is.
Well, I've seen, over the years, I've known people who were murdered. I've seen, people who were murderers and talked with them. And, there's evil to me is, it's a human activity, that is done, that harms others, including the environment, I would say. I mean, the Catholic Church now is even speaking about how, human-caused damage to the environment, especially as it affects poor people in other places, and actually, environmental problems, climate change is causing the premature deaths of a lot of children as well around the world. That's another life issue now.
Well, that's certainly in opposition to a culture of life, right?
Right. So evil is definitely. I mean, there's levels for it. But it's. I mean, real evil would be intentional harm, destruction, dehumanization of other people.
You see, this is where it becomes, I don't want to get into an abstract theological discussion, maybe a little bit, but not too much because, but, by the way, if you just tuned in, you're listening to Tobias Winwright, and he is an associate professor of theological ethics, Department of Theological Studies at St. Louis University. And what is the most recent book that you wrote?
The most recent one I edited and contributed to was, oh, goodness gracious. You've got me talking so much I don't even see it.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Is that Smoke Clears, Just War and Post-War Justice.
What about violence transformation? Violence transformation in the sacred?
Violence transformation in the sacred. That was from College Theology Society meeting a couple of years ago. So,
okay.
And I'm editing another one right now on Pope Benedict and climate change.
Yeah. So the question here is that there is a certain continuum of the weight of the value of the evil that's done. Obviously abortion is not the same as masturbation or something like that. I mean, even if you do think it's evil, you see, a person like me, from my point of view, and I'm not religious, I really am not religious. I won't go through the same usual song and dance about how I'm spiritual, though I'm not religious.
Okay.
But maybe I am. But there are certain people who, and I don't like to use this word evil too much because, again, the older I get, the less I tend to judge people, and I'm starting from a very serious judgmental point. But I look at somebody like John Brennan, or and I'm interested in this because you just laid out what possibly might be a definition of evil, which is malice aforethought, maybe repeated over and over again, when
right.
You know people are going to be harmed, and even innocent people are going to be harmed. The president and Mr. Brennan, who will soon be the head of the CIA, meet every Tuesday, and they have something called a kill list. I'm sure you're familiar with this, right?
Yes.
Okay, they have a kill list, and they know, because they get the after-action reports, that close to or more than 1,000 people are innocent victims of these drone strikes. Something like, 20 to 25% of the people who were struck by these missiles or in the area turn out to be completely innocent civilians. They blow up wedding parties sometimes by accident, right? And they meet. Still, they know that. They see the after-action reports. They probably even see pictures from satellites, and they keep doing it. To me, I have to say, that sounds like evil.
Yeah. A few years ago, I wrote an article about cluster munitions.
Oh, right.
Cluster bombs. And turns out the research shows that 90% of the casualties from cluster munitions are civilians. So there's now, an international ban being supported on cluster munitions, and yet the U.S. and some of our allies, we still use those. So, I mean, knowing that a weapon is going to kill so many civilians, at some point you can't justify it. It's disproportionate. So the same thing may be happening with drones. And actually, I'm working with several other theologians, Catholic and Protestant. Right now, this weekend, we're drafting a statement on the drones.
Oh, really?
And using Just War teaching in order to critique the administration's current use of drones. We think that drones in and of themselves might be different from a nuclear bomb or from a cluster munition. I mean, a drone might be able to be used in an actual theater of war. That's another issue there, rather than in a country we're not in war with. But maybe in a real battleground, a drone could be used and used in a discriminating, effective way. But as they are currently being used, it seems to be violating many principles and raising a number of concerns amongst a lot of theologians and ethicists right now.
I guess one of the things to consider, I suppose, or maybe you are doing it or somebody's doing it in your meeting this weekend, is the fact of the psychological effect. And there was a big study at Stanford University of the fact of the drones hovering for days on end above whole areas of territory where children are afraid to leave their houses or go to school.
Yes. One of my friends, Megan Clark, was just in, I think she was in Sudan, and she was in a market, and she's an American white theologian, Catholic at St. John's University, and she was walking through the market, and she bumped into someone, and as she was walking away with her guide, that person said something, and somebody else said something to that person, and they laughed, and Megan asked her guide, well, what did they say? And the guide said, they were just joking that, you better watch out. Since you bumped into that American woman, they will send their planes, referring to the drones, to get you. So, I mean, in parts of the world right now, this is really affecting our reputation as a country. And there could be serious blowback on this at some point. I mean, Iran right now claims, I don't know if it's bogus or not, that because of that down drone that they did not too long ago, that they now are making their own, and at some point, others are going to have them too, and we sure would.
Well, they already do have them,
right? We shouldn't. We sure wouldn't want them using them here. So, right now we've got the advantage, but the thing about Just War is might doesn't mean right, and we should, just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should do something. To do a little pun on my last name, my surname, we're supposed to try to win, but we're supposed to win rightly and follow the rules.
Surely a lot of people would find that. I mean, obviously that's an ongoing argument. A lot of people would say, all's fair in love and war. I mean, rules of engagement, rules of combat when you're fighting an enemy who wants to destroy you. What rules?
The administration and President Obama says that there are these rules and that we are supposed to follow them.
Yeah,
and
he made
right. There are others that disagree with that.
There are rules which he made up.
Right. He's not supposed to make them up, and he changing the definitions. That's one of the things we're going to talk about. He's redefining who is a combatant, who's not a combatant. They've been redefining what is imminent threat. The Bush administration started redefining that with regard to Iraq. So these words, they're not, I mean, they may need to be modified with, passing of time, but one should not just redefine them. And the problem is, and this is what a lot of my pacifist Christian friends will point out, the Just War tradition is abused all the time. It's used to rationalize something that a country is going to do anyway. And John Courtney Murray was a Jesuit theologian in mid-20th century. He said, well, people do that all the time with the Ten Commandments. They break them and they rationalize whatever. That doesn't mean you jettison the Ten Commandments. The same thing.
I see. So in other words, because the valid underpinnings of the theory or the practice of a just war are often sullied or insulted by the behavior of governments, doesn't mean that the argument should disappear entirely.
Right. The abuse does not negate the use. So we're trying to use this stuff and to try to help them to have more teeth so that people will be more honest about their invocation of the just war tradition.
Let me ask you this question. I don't want to keep you on forever here, but let's say somebody, let's say there was a draft now, and you were a young man, and you know what you know now. Would you have, I mean, I had to face this, and a lot of people did in my generation with Vietnam, whether or not to obey the draft.
Well, we didn't have the draft when I was young.
Right.
And I was in ROTC for a little while, but I didn't sign and go through with it because I was worried. Even though I was in law enforcement, even though I was only an undergraduate, I was worried about being put in a situation that I might find in my conscience to be unjust and contrary to the just war tradition. So I didn't pursue that. Now, if there was a draft, right now, our country recognizes conscientious objection, but that's only for pacifists, people who are nonviolent and against all use of force. Our country doesn't allow for selective conscientious objection for just war people. So if you're a Christian who believes that sometimes lethal force is justified under these certain rules and criteria, and you find your country is involved in an action that is contrary to those principles, our country doesn't recognize that as a legitimate, excuse to avoid the draft. So if we had the draft and I were in a young person right now, I'd be in, potentially some hot water. And maybe have to do like most of the people that fled to Canada in the Vietnam era. Not all of those were pacifists. In fact, probably most of them had reasons that were more, even though they might not have been able to articulate it as such, but really had more to do with just war tradition.
Yeah, also it was political and personal and that. So last question here is, do you actually, what would you have to say? Put it this way. What would you have to say here? Because you did sign this letter. What do you have to say to the millions of Christians in this country who are adamantly opposed to abortion and just as adamantly opposed to any kind of gun control? What do you have to say?
Both of these issues involve innocence, and especially, the gun one involves a lot of innocent children too, and our respect for life does not stop after a baby is born. It continues afterwards, and so even though there may be 1 million abortions a year and 10,000 victims of murder per year, one in either category is too much. And we need to be doing whatever we can to try to minimize as much as possible the deaths in either one of these.
Is there a place where people could go online to read the things that you've written or other people who are associated with you have written?
Oh, one place to start. There's a blog that I helped to start, and it has 18 Catholic moral theologians on it. It's called CatholicMoralTheology.com.
Okay. Oh, .com, really?
Yes.
Okay, CatholicMoralTheology.com. That's a good place to go.
That'd be a place to start, and we deal with a lot of other issues, and also there's connections to our books and articles and whatnot there as well. So Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, sure. We're going to take a break, and then maybe we'll try to take some calls on this issue. I appreciate you coming on.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Tobias Winwright, and you heard what he had to say. Are you a Christian? Are you a Catholic? What's your opinion about all these things? About Brennan? Do you have the same attitude towards guns and gun control that you have towards abortion? If you're a real Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, should you not be opposing any kind of violence? And as a practical matter, don't we have to make decisions and choices when it comes to things like that? These are the questions that we want to talk about. The number here is 866-997-4748. And I really need to hear some opinions about this, get some calls on this from any point of view. You don't have to be a Christian or a Catholic. You could be a Sufi or a Hindu, or you could be a member of the Church of Scientology. Ooh, and then we'll go to a break. Okay, we're back. This is Mike Fader. Once again, to remind you, this is not the only place where I say things and interview people and talk out loud about things on the radio. Go to faderfiles.com, and you can check out other things that I do. Let us go to our first caller, who is George from Pennsylvania. Go ahead.
Oh, hey, Mike.
Hey.
First of all, in relation to the last thing you talked about with your interview guest, there's no such thing as a pro-life conservative. They're only pro-birth conservatives because after they're born, they don't give a shit what happens to that kid.
We've seen plenty of that. Like, there's no support for them. There's no help for them. Yeah.
Oh, sure. You have to have the kid. You can't abort the kid. You must give birth to that kid. But after that, do you want help with your insurance? Do you want help with health? Do you want help with feeding the kid? Well, hey, that's not our problem. We didn't tell you to have the kid, right? That's
right.
Basically right. After that, I what you addressed talking about torture and what's been going on since, virtually since the birth of history. The fact of the matter is that we, human beings, are scumbags. We do whatever it takes to instill in ourselves a sense of security and what is right. And if it means tearing somebody from limb, that's what we'll do. That hasn't changed since the beginning of time, since the beginning of recorded history.
So, in other words, survival dictates our actions.
Exactly. That's who we are. And if there is anything that gives me hope in this life, it's that what we are doing to this planet with regards to environment, global warming, whatever you want to call it, someday, hopefully, we will be extinct. We will go the way of the dinosaurs, and the rest of the earth can get on with its way without our presence, because to me, that's the only hope in this world.
Sounds right to me. You think I'll still have my radio show?
Yeah, I know it's a downer and it's cynical, but that's the only hope I can hold.
I don't mind if the human race is extinct as long as I'm able to keep on my show.
Well,
I probably will get fewer calls, right?
It's not going to happen in my lifetime.
Okay.
But hopefully it'll happen sometime.
I can't argue with you. I'm going to move on to another call.
Thank you.
Okay. What do we have? Bill from Minnesota.
Yeah, hi. I have two things to say. One in response to Mike. There was a time in history when there was no torture in one place. Oddly enough, Russia, the son of Ivan the Terrible, was a kind of saint who forbid any torture for 15 years at the end of the 16th century. And that was because he was a Christian saint. And the other thing I wanted to say was another fact, which is, you know what country in Europe has the lowest rate of abortion?
And what country would that be?
It would be France. And the reason is lower than Catholic Spain, lower than conservative Ireland, and it's because they take care of you from the time you're pregnant until, they really take care of the pregnant woman, and they have all kinds of social services to come and help her if she needs them, and then the baby will be taken care of by creche, the state-sponsored nursery program, and so on. In other words, they give every incentive to a woman to have her baby. So it seems to me that people who are so against abortion would be in favor of all of that state service.
No, it makes perfect sense. But in fact, obviously, they're not. So that's the great irony and the contradiction,
Well, that's all I had to say.
Sure, good. I mean, it's true. Those people have no explanation for that kind of ridiculous contradiction. Okay, who do we have?
Hello?
Jerome, you're on, Jerome.
Yeah, as far as the drones is concerned, my question is, what do you think is the potential of that weapon to develop into something more severe than what it is? For right now, we know that they can send it certain places and pick out certain personalities or people they don't like and eliminate them.
Mm-hmm.
And they may do that here. You never know, since these movements.
They probably will do that here. They already have surveillance drones flying over the continental USA.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got movements here. We got the Occupy movement and the Tea Party. I'm pretty sure they're watching both of them because they both have potential probably to turn into revolutionary movements.
Yeah, well.
So they got the drones there, just in case things get out of control. Maybe they don't need concentration camps anymore.
Hey, one day, you'll be walking down the street.
Oh.
You'll be walking down the street in Portland or New York City or maybe, Muskegee someplace, and boom, you and half the block will be gone because somebody wrote a text that the president didn't like.
Right, or they can knock the radio show off.
Yeah, they could. I don't know. I mean, a drone here would cause a lot of collateral damage, and I feel bad for my engineer. He never says this stuff.
But as far as Obama is concerned, I don't think Obama really makes the decision. I think there's somebody in the 1% that's giving all the orders.
Well, but he is in the 1%.
Yeah, he's a minor player, though. I think there's people over him.
Well, certainly,
That
Mr. Brennan is the major dude here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right.
So that's my thought.
Okay. Thanks for calling.
Sure.
Anybody else right now? Matt from Michigan, you're on.
Yeah. Hi,
Oh,
Mike.
I can only give you about a minute because we're up against the end of the hour.
Okay, I had questions I would like to have asked both of your guests. First of all, I would like to have asked the guest if any of the Nuremberg defendants had been tortured. Then I'd also would like to have asked him if there are any languages that he knows of that don't have any words for torture.
Interesting.
Because that would be a way to get at, whether every society has used torture. I suspect there probably aren't any, but I certainly don't know. And then I would like to have kind of got specific with your last guest, since he was in law enforcement, about proportionality. Because, we hear case after case of a defendant being shot 20, 30, sometimes more than 80 times.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, we got a police force across the country, even in my little town here where I live, where it's becoming more and more militarized. They're buying these sort of tank-like vehicles. They're talking about drones. And beyond the use of lethal force, we have this kind of obsession now with tasers. If you look at any authority...
I have to interrupt you. I've only got about 30 seconds for you.
Anyway, this whole issue of tasers, too. If anybody looks at an authority figure cross-eyed, they get tasered now. So I would like to have,
Yeah, sure. Well, that's the issue. But we did talk about that. But how many times do you kill people, and how much ordnance you use to just do one single thing that you're supposed to achieve? It's overkill all the time, which is a phrase that existed before Vietnam but got used constantly in Vietnam. How many times do you actually kill somebody? Enough is enough already. Anyhow, we got to go. We'll be back after 7 o'clock if you want to call back and continue this after the 7 o'clock news. All right. Thanks for calling. All right. That's it for now. We'll see you after then. And this is Mike Fader. We're back again on Sirius XM Left 127. We have a guest coming up to talk about women in the military and women in combat. And but before she'll be on in just a minute or so, I want to make something clear. People are constantly asking me. I've been on here 8.5 years now on Sirius. People are always asking me for copies of this show, right? And guests ask me, listeners ask me. People are always asking me, can they post it online? Can they do that? Can they give copies of it to people? Sirius does not permit me to give out copies of this show, and they don't like copies of the show to be posted anywhere online or distributed anywhere else. So let me just make sure that you understand. It would be wrong for you to do that. You could do that. You could post these shows on YouTube if you wanted to. You could post these shows online. You could put them on your blog. You could do anything you wanted like that, but it would be wrong. Also, you could record these shows and you could distribute them to other people and you could refer people to them, but it would be wrong. I just want you to remember that. You can do that, but it would be wrong. Okay, so we talked, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, or was it last week or 2 weeks ago, about this decision that the government made about women are able to serve now in combat. Of course, some women have already served in combat, but now it's an official policy of the Pentagon. And we have somebody on tonight who's written an article about this and about women in the military in general. And that's Lucinda Marshall, who is with us tonight. Hi.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Okay. Now let me introduce you to people, and then we'll get to our issue here. Lucinda Marshall is the director of the Feminist Peace Network, which she founded in December 2001 as a virtual, quote, room of our own, end quote, where women concerned about how the impending U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, God, that seems like ancient history now, although it's still happening.
It doesn't exist.
It's amazing. And later, Iraq would impact women's lives, could share their thoughts and ideas for action in a safe, supportive space. While initially focusing on militarism, the network, with participants from around the world, has expanded its vision and also addressed what Marshall calls the other terrorism, the systematic global pandemic of violence and human rights violations against women. And she's written numerous articles in a wide variety of publications. Also authors the Occupy Patriarchy website, which is interesting to me since I spent so many shows about the Occupy movement. The Occupy Patriarchy website, which was begun in the fall of 2011 to address the issues of misogyny and women's rights within the Occupy movement. And let's see, in addition to the Feminist Peace Network blog, my guest, Lucinda Marshall, also authors her own blog, Reclaiming Medusa. And that's at Lucinda Marshall, lucindamarshall.com. This issue of women, I read this on Common Dreams, the website Common Dreams. It says here, why serving in combat does not serve women. Let me just read the first couple of paragraphs here, and then we can talk about this. Crucial as it is for women to have the same opportunities and benefits as men do who do comparable work, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta's announcement that women can now serve in combat positions in the military should not be misconstrued as a step forward for women. Let's see, skipping ahead just a little bit. We do not celebrate this new, quote, elimination of a gender-based barrier, end quote. We do not celebrate sending us women overseas to kill other women and children in someone else's name. Now, of course, you're aware of the fact that a lot of people, some of whom call themselves feminists, have celebrated this as a step forward, including, I guess, Gail Collins in the New York Times and some other people. And other people are saying, finally, equality, et cetera, et cetera. But you don't see it that way, right?
Well, it's a complicated issue, and I've talked to a number of people about it, and we all, I think, actually are more on common ground than it actually sounds like. And to be very, very clear, I absolutely think that women should be paid equally for work that they do that is the same as work that men do, and that they should be compensated for that, and that they should have every equal opportunity that men have. But when you're talking about the military, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. And if I could maybe just quote a little bit of the background that I used in the Common Dreams article, because I think when you start to look at some of these statistics, it becomes a little bit clearer. Women now make up about 14% of the enlisted ranks in the military and about 16% of the officer ranks. But what gets really interesting to me is when you look at the racial breakdown of that, and it's a little bit complicated to explain, but about 71% of active duty men in the military are white versus about, I think it's 53% of women. So a higher percentage of women in the military are women of color versus men. And when you look at that economically, usually, when we look at economic statistics and so on, those tend to be the people who are at the bottom rungs of the economic ladder. And sure enough, when you talk to female vets about why they joined the military, they are much more likely to say that it was because jobs were hard to find compared with why men joined the military. So if you want to talk about economically empowering women, I would sure rather see focusing on job training and job availability in the civilian world so that they are not in a situation where they feel that they're joining the military because it's the only economic option open to them. Mm-hmm. Because, when you come down to it, the military provides jobs, but it's not there as an employment office. The purpose of the military is something entirely different. And when we start to see that as an employment opportunity rather than, say, serving your country or defending the country, mm-hmm. And I would personally argue that most of our conflicts these days don't have a great deal to do directly with defending the country. Then it becomes a different thing. And I think you have to sort of just look at it a little bit more comprehensively than just within the military itself, but look at it in that economic context.
So, theoretically speaking, if you had if you had an ideal situation where there was full employment available for everybody, and especially training and employment for people who didn't have the advantages of other people, for men and for women, you'd probably have about 1/3 of the current military force, right?
Well, I don't know, as far as exact numbers, but obviously it would be less, and you wouldn't necessarily have the skewer you have now with why people join and why, say, more poor women and, for that matter, men. You don't see a lot of people at the upper echelons of the economic ladder joining the military.
Well, I've had callers to the program who made it very clear. I mean, people who were veterans for like 20, 25 years, and then they made it very clear the reason they joined was to find an occupation and to get some training. They had no intention of joining for to defend the country or our brave boys and girls overseas defending our freedoms, or whatever nonsense that you hear on sports programs and everything.
Right, exactly. And, so you need to separate those things out in terms of, well, what's the military there for and why are people joining? It's by design that it is the way it is. There's no doubt about that. But the other thing that I think comes into this, and which I did mention in that article as well, is that not 24 hours after Leon Panetta announced that women would be allowed into combat positions, you had people in the military and then in Gail Collins and a variety of other people saying, well, this is good because it'll make it less likely that women will be sexually assaulted in the military. And I was just appalled by this.
Now, what was the reasoning? What was their reasoning there?
Well, that's the part that is just, for me, just stupefying. Collins said, well, it'll mean that there's more attention to women's issues, and then you've got General Dempsey, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, well, more equality will lead to more respect and hence less sexual assault. Well, here's the deal. This announcement came literally the day that Congress was holding hearings about sexual assault at the Lackland Air Force Base. And when you compare these statements with what actually, say, happened at that hearing, and be very clear that this is the latest in a long series of hearings where there's lots of testimony, lots of reports filed, and we still have an absolute epidemic of sexual assault in the military. And the truth is, women are still going to be a very small percentage of the military for quite some time to come, even if we were working towards a 50-50 thing. I mean, look at Congress, for heaven's sake.
Right.
This isn't something that suddenly overnight there's equality. And women in the military is a top-down institution. It's a power-over institution, which is the same mechanism, way of thinking as sexual assault, which is you're trying to assert power over another person. And women at the bottom ranks are still going to have that problem. And one of the huge problems is that the military just refuses to change the way that they allow women to report sexual assaults, such that they're still reporting them to their superiors. It's still within the system. And the problem with that is that there's an awful lot of repercussions. A lot of times women still end up working with the people who may have assaulted them, or they are the ones who are effectively victimized because they are transferred. It's a problematic system. So, you on the one hand, you've got the military refusing to act on sexual assault, and then them saying, "Oh, well, we'll send women into combat, and that'll help the sexual assault problem." Is
there no basis for this reasoning? In other words, some of the reasoning I read, and I think it was part of what Gail Collins was trying to say, but some other people have put it even better. In fact, there were some women, you probably read that New York Times article, which interviewed in depth certain women who felt very disappointed that they were officers and couldn't rise any higher than captain or whatever it was, and they had to quit because they really wanted to make a career out of it, but they weren't going anywhere, right? But one of the reasons why people get promoted, in fact, the main reason people get promoted, and this goes back all the way in the history of any military, is because of often what happens in combat or in warfare, right? This is where they get promoted. So a lot of women were bemoaning the fact, this is professional military women, or people who wanted to make a profession were bemoaning the fact that they couldn't achieve higher rank because they weren't allowed in combat. Now, so you think there's no basis whatsoever to the fact that if women, let's say it's 20 years from now, turn out to be exactly equal in terms of the number of officers or high-ranking officers, that there wouldn't be, this wouldn't affect anything had to do with the current plague of sexual assault and
theoretically, hopefully it would.
Yeah.
Hopefully it would make a huge difference. But I think it's really theoretical because, I just I use Congress as kind of an example. I don't think this is going to happen in 20 years, maybe in 200. And then even at that, you look at things like in Congress, we are once again having to go back to square one with things like the Violence Against Women Act, which they failed to reauthorize last term, and now we're going through it all over again, and a host of other things that I don't think women's equality is anywhere close to being high on the priority list for the military or anyone else, in terms of how we run this country.
So why do you think that that the guys at the top decided to do this?
Good question. And I think a lot of it is the politics of it, and hopefully it is a good thing. I mean, I would like for women to be treated equally in the military, with the caveat that I am a pacifist. I am not in favor of violent action, and to say that I'm in favor of women rising in a system that has systematically been bad for women since the dawn of patriarchy, and be very clear that it isn't just women in our military, it's women, say, in areas that are undergoing conflict. Women's bodies are routinely used as weapons of war. Rape is used as a tactic in war. Women in refugee camps who have had to escape conflict are incredibly vulnerable to sexual violence, other forms of violence, not to mention, economic.
So, in other words, for women to participate actively carrying weapons in combat is really just part of this whole attack on women, the way you see it, right?
Yeah, it's just problematic to say rising to the top of a system that does this is a good thing for women, and that's where I have the problem.
Well, let me ask you this question, and this ventures straight into the area of stereotypes, but why not, right? This is human nature, sort of, or the way people have been educated, anyhow. Put it that way. A lot of people regard women as the more caring sex, the more maternal, the more caring sex, and it's a shock and it's upsetting to a lot of people, maybe men and women, for women to be seen and to be treated equally as warriors and as people who kill other people rather than nurture them. Does this resonate at all?
Well,
is that a patriarchal way of looking at it?
It's difficult. My higher self would like to think, of course women are by nature more nurturing, etc. Of course that is not true. Some women are, some men are. And it would be nice to be able to say, well, this will make us a kinder, gentler military, too. That's kind of oxymoronic, in my opinion.
Oxymoronic in every way, yes.
Yeah, so I don't see it as, yes, if people want to be shocked that women can carry weapons and do that, that's kind of their problem, in my opinion, at this point. I mean, I totally believe women are just as capable as men of being warriors and of doing that, should that be what they so choose to do.
Actually,
I think it's a good idea. That's another story.
I don't know where you live, but we found that out in the New York City Police Department when women were increasingly allowed, to serve in the New York City Police Department, which is all combat, unless they're at a desk job, or could be, let's say. When it comes to shootings, they were just as liable to empty their guns into people, sometimes even people who were innocent, as anybody else.
Well, and I think, this has been proven time and again in a variety of situations. But, the other side of that is the military has very purposely taken some of the women who are in the military, and you see stories about this all the time, about how the women get sent into villages to try to connect with people and that sort of thing, and to bring them into conversation,
right,
and perhaps behave a little bit more gently than the men do. And so, the military routinely uses that stereotype. So it's just a mess of sort of what we expect, what we play around with in terms of how we frame all of this.
Well, just to extend that before we move on to something else here, there's been a long time. This goes back thousands of years, and certainly people talk about this even currently, that if women were in charge of the world, if they were in charge of governments all over the place, and thus the military, that there would be, and this is part of the same argument, I guess, there would be less violence, less slaughter, et cetera, et cetera.
Again, I wish I had a crystal ball about that, but I tend to think that probably is true because women have not been as prone necessarily to playing a part of the empire-building pyramid scheme power thingy that goes on in this world now, and women, not by definition, but basically historically have been put in charge of the caring work on this planet, of taking care of the elderly, of taking care of children, and so on, whether or not we choose to. But that experience does teach you something, I think. And whether that would have an impact or not, I can't say for sure. I suspect it would.
But there is but there is also the biological determinism. Men don't carry children around inside them and give birth to them in great pain. You know what I mean?
Correct. Yeah, and I'm me, myself, and that would certainly be a part, and I'm a mother, a part of how I do see things, and I believe in nurturing things. But that's me. I'm not going to say that that's a society thing. But yes, we do have that experience. That said, there's a lot of fathers out there who have raised children and are every bit as nurturing as women. So it's not a cut and dry, black and white sort of situation by a long shot.
Well, let me ask you this question. A lot of the places where we are at war, if you want to put it that way, politely, that's just one way to put
right.
it. And a lot of places where we have our sworn enemies who are trying to kill us, so we have to kill all of them, according to Mr. Brennan, et cetera. A lot of these places we're at war, and I don't think we should be in these places, Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, right? On the other hand, sometimes it gets complex. But one thing about a lot of these places is that we're at war, or that we potentially might be at war, or that the guys who are in charge of the military and the government seem to be one at war forever. Men treat women very, very badly, and perhaps generally speaking, worse than any other place on earth. Who is going to stop? This is a really kind of a all over the map question, but who is going to stop these men from? Let me put it this way. I have a friend, my best friend, whose father used to beat him up all the time when he was growing up. And he once went to his mother and said, he was about 10 years old. He says, "Mom, why do we need men?" And she said, "To protect us from other men." I'll never forget him telling me this, right? And sometimes, when I look at these wars, which are wrong in almost every way I could possibly imagine, for all sorts of moral, politically, geographically, strategically, you name it. But yet there are men in the world who treat women so badly that it's unbelievable. Who is going to ever stop these men from doing that? Or should anybody be taken upon themselves the mission of doing it?
Well, let me put it to you this way. As you no doubt remember, when we first went into Afghanistan, one of the great sales pitches was, well, we've got to rescue the women from the Taliban.
Right.
And then it was the same deal when we went into Iraq, although women in Iraq at that time were actually doing far better than in quite a few countries in the Middle East. And after we went in, things got dramatically worse. But look at the progress, and I put air quotes around that, that women have made in Afghanistan. Yes, there has been a little bit, but the problems are still absolutely enormous. We did not go into Afghanistan to rescue women. That was not the mission. It was the sales pitch, but it was not the mission, and that's been really incidental. If we wanted to go in and substantively help women there, we would be doing so with a humanitarian mission, not a war mission that goes and destroys homes and villages and makes the men there even more angry and more prone to attack, and to also take it out on the women in their own homes. That's not helping anybody, in my opinion. And the other thing that we really need to do is make women full-fledged players at the table when we come to resolving conflicts, and usually women are almost invisible in those discussions. They are rarely present. There are some UN resolutions that are working towards getting women more involved in conflict resolution and peace building, and in fact last year, actually quite significantly, I think, the Obama administration put together a national action plan on women, peace, and security, which will start to create a process where we are really actively supporting these resolutions, and that's really important. But
it sounds sort of theoretical to me.
it's hugely theoretical, and it's going to take a lot of time. But right now there are no women usually at peace negotiations, very few of them. We need to have women fully participating in those things.
But to have women at peace negotiations, let's say from any particular country, you would have to change the entire culture and patriarchal organization of that country, and you can't do that from externally.
No, you can't. But you can also, for one thing, lead by example. You can start providing aid that helps to promote that. But I don't generally think military missions accomplish that. That's what I'm going for.
I would agree with you. So if you have, I don't know if this, so as far as women being now permitted to, or I don't know about encouraged, but certainly permitted to actively involve themselves in combat, you don't see anything to applaud here, and you don't see maybe any particular positive outcome from this.
I think that for women who are in the military right now, it may make some differences for some women. Do I think in the large scheme of things it's a helpful idea or something that serves women well? No, I don't.
Where can people, if you just tuned in, you're listening to Lucinda Marshall, and where can people go? Give me a couple of places where people can go to read your work.
Well, there's a number of places. The first thing I would probably do is Google it. But beyond that, the feministpeacenetwork.org website has quite a few pieces that I've written. I'm the primary author of the blog as well as my own blog, lucindamarshall.com. And I've written, as you said, for Common Dreams and for a number of other places out there. So if you want to particularly read about what I've written about militarism and violence against women, Google that specifically, and you'll come up with quite a collection of articles. And plus, we're on Facebook, as well as I'm hoping after tonight to have a whole bunch more followers on Twitter. So
okay.
Anyhow, but so yeah, there are quite a variety of places to find it.
Actually, there was one thing in the very beginning when I was introducing you. You mentioned something about patriarchy in the Occupy movement. I have done a tremendous amount of programming devoted to the Occupy movement. In fact, I've got an entire whole other radio show, which is almost specifically devoted to the Occupy movement and its goals. And the idea that there's patriarchy in the Occupy movement is news to me. Can you explain that a little bit?
Oh, gosh. We're going to need another half hour there. But
okay.
There was, when the Occupy movement started, and looking at this historically, this isn't really anything new. During the anti-war movement, during Vietnam, during a lot of various liberal left-wing movements, there has been a great deal of misogyny and patriarchy involved, and women having trouble getting their voices heard. And the Occupy movement was, in a lot of ways, not any different than that in terms of who had the microphone to start with, who was able to get heard, women getting what they were saying taken seriously. There were a number of instances of women feeling threatened and, in fact, being threatened and assaulted. Not a great many of those, but some. And part of it was just how that was handled. And I think, by and large, it was a learning experience for a lot of people, and particularly for perhaps the younger generation that is, this is really one of the first big movements for a lot of people.
Sure.
To confront this and to realize that this happened And, you know, I don't know why we would think that that would necessarily be any different than the world at large, where this stuff takes place all the time still, that you would, in fact, find it there. And the reason we really started that website was to be sure that there was a place that was being documented, where it was being discussed, and to start looking at some strategies for dealing with it. And as the Occupy movement developed, a number of women found a lot of very creative, great ways of confronting this, addressing this, and I say women, but also men as well, really, to make sure that it did get addressed. And I think a lot of changes came out of that. And there was, towards, I guess it was last summer, there was the feminist General Assembly started in New York and other places that really started to address issues that took into account women's participation in the movement as well.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and give the blog. Give me one address where people should go. I mean, aside from Googling, one more time. And then we'll do.
Sure. FeministPeaceNetwork.org.
Okay, Lucinda Marshall. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to go to a break, and when we come back, feel free to call up. We've got John Brennan, who is an extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily blood-curdling individual, and his talk about drones and all that talk about torture. And you've got the sad circus he was involved in, that scripted circus where these old, wrinkly dudes and women basically kissed his ass the whole time, except for Senator Ron Wyden. And who cares anyhow? I mean, really, the Democrats, the Republicans, hearings, does it make any difference to our lives? The last thing anybody did that affected my life particularly was when President Obama didn't do a damn thing to rich people and loaded tens of billions of dollars of more onerous payments out of our paychecks by reinstituting the 2% tax for Social Security. Everybody who's listening to me now, without exception, probably maybe 1% of the people listening to me maybe don't fit into this, but almost all of you know right away, firsthand, what it's like if you get a check that you have less money than you used to have with the price of everything going up. So people write to me. My best friend here, who calls up all the time, my best email correspondent, Mitchell, always writes to me. He wrote to me today, and he calls up, and he has these long, reasonable, the nicest guy in the world, very intelligent. He calls up, and he tells me, he says, well, I think you've gone a little too, I hear this all the time. I heard this last fall, when the election was, you're a little too radical. I mean, your point of view here is your assumptions are too cynical and they're too radical. You know what? And then people argue with me. Well, the Democrats and the Republicans, and if only the responsibility is taken, and you have to look on the positive side. What Obama, you know what? No, I don't anymore. The older I get, the more I read history, the more I look at current events, the more I listen to their bullshit, and the more I see what they actually do. When, for instance, recently the president sold out to rich people completely and burdened everybody in the middle class, including me, my wife, everybody else that I know, and probably most of you, with extra money when at a time we can hardly afford anything anyhow, that we have to pay out, where he didn't tax rich people the way he should have. I give up on all of it. And I can't even have a discussion anymore like they have on MSNBC. It amuses me to watch MSNBC sometimes, because you see all these people get on, like Chris Matthews, and I exempt Ed Schultz a little bit because I feel like he's not exactly like the rest of the crowd, and maybe the Reverend Al. But I see Rachel Maddow, I see especially Chris Matthews, who get on there. They make $5 million, $10 million a year, and they have these long discussions. They have the same old tired faces on week after week after week, the experts, right? The people who ran failed campaigns, the same inside crowd, and they argue amongst each other about what the president should do, what the Republicans did, what the Democrats did, this bill in Congress. It's all a lot of silly bread and circuses bullshit. I don't care about it anymore. It's so antique. It's so beside the point of what they're really doing to us and what we really need to do back to get our country back, or to get it back in the first place. This is meaningless crap. If you're entertained by this, I suppose that's one thing. I would rather watch, wrestling or an old movie or a hockey game than to listen to the learned, repetitious, same old drivel from political commentators all the time who are concerned about what the Democrats are doing or what the Republicans are doing. You know what they're doing. They're doing us. All right? So it's time to dump all that. It's time to dump all that. Free yourself, brothers and sisters. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Get rid of these people, Democrats and Republicans. Don't get caught up in this argument where they say, take a look at this, everybody. The Democrats and Republicans are arguing with each other. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're not really arguing with each other. Just look at that hearing with Brennan. That illustrates every example of that. Let's go to a break and we'll come back. Okay, so, Democrats and Republicans, give me a fucking break. How about this? These are the people who are going to decide whether or not, what your taxes are going to be like, whether the middle class gets treated right. These are the people who are bargaining with the president, and everybody worries about all this partisan politics. There isn't any partisan politics. What you're seeing is the top of a silly rubber iceberg where a bunch of people are yelling at each other, where underneath they're joined at the hip. How about this? In principle, it sounds here. No pay, little sacrifice from many in Congress, little sacrifice. In principle, it sounds self-sacrificing, even noble. Congress swears off collecting its paychecks until it passes a budget. That's the new game they're playing for our consumption, right? But behind the no budget, no pay proposal, which the House passed last week when it voted to temporarily extend the debt limit, is also a basic reality. Many of those who support the concept are so wealthy that the congressional paychecks represent little more than a rounding error. Take Representative Dave Camp, a Michigan Republican who led the charge on the measure in the House. He has a net worth of between $3.8 million and $9.7 million, depending on which sleazy accountant you talk to, according to an analysis of his most recent financial disclosure by the Center for Responsive Politics. That is not exactly a fortune befitting a Rockefeller or a Kennedy, but it is more than enough to cushion any discomfort he might feel from missing a few paydays. Many other lawmakers who have championed no budget, no pay, both Republicans and Democrats, are similarly wealthy. Congress, for all its Democratic trappings, has long been richer than a typical collection of 535 average Americans. But the gap between the financial standing of members of Congress and the population as a whole appears to have grown in recent decades, analysts of financial disclosure firms say. The median net worth of American households is $66,740, while for the 535 members of Congress, it is about $966,000, or 15 times larger. These people who everybody argues about whether the Republicans or the Democrats will prevail, all these people who are Democrats and Republicans, some of whom have hundreds of millions of dollars, who have an average net worth of close to $1 million, who make $174,000 base pay a year, plus God knows how much other money and corruption and speeches that they make. These people are the people you're worried about arguing with each other or who's going to prevail on what's going to happen to us. They're the same people. Who do we have on the line? Abdul, you're on, babe.
Hey, Mike.
Hey.
Hope you're making it through the snow tonight.
No problem. No problem.
Gotcha. The thing that I'm just taking it back, it's like you were blown away by this whole Dog and Pony show with Panetta and this Brennan character. I'm blown away down here with conversations with some of these supporters of Obama who are really pleased to justify these drone attacks with American citizens. I'm like, don't you know these guys are citizens, right? But they're like, so what? You know, they take up arms against us, blow them away. They gotta go. They're terrorists now. It's like, wait a minute. I expect this kind of thing from Tea Republicans, those Tea Party folks. And now I'm hearing it from you guys. I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Who am I been hanging out with all wrong?
I hate to tell you this, but you're on the road, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, your signal is so bad that it's breaking up to the point where we can hardly understand you. But basically, I'll repeat what you said, is you're upset and irritated and probably somewhat amazed, although not so much anymore. The Democrats are telling you that we got to get rid of these terrorists, even if they are American citizens. And you never expected to hear that from Democrats about a Democratic president, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, well.
So I'm just like, and I'm by myself at this point almost. Just feel alone right now, you know?
Yeah,
but,
it's true. It's true. I mean, basically, this is what you got from Senator Feinstein, who was the chair of the Senate hearing this week. She was actually on there. It was, if it happened in a court, she would be removed from the bench and lose her job. She's the chairperson of the committee. She's supposed to be, examining Mr. Brennan, advising and consenting to see whether or not he's fit for his office. She gets on there and she was making his case for him. She was talking about how evil all these terrorists are, even if they are American citizens. And she's reading his lines for him. And he was saying, "You're absolutely right, Senator." All they had to do is drop their dresses and pants and start kissing each other's asses.
Right. So I am glad during those hearings that someone shouted out, a few people shouted out in protest. I think it got so bad they almost had to clear the room, right?
Yeah, what happened was in the beginning, people from Code Pink interrupted the hearings 5 times, so they had to send them out of the room and then let everybody back in, but nobody who would actually interfere with their mutual circle jerk. I'm going to move on.
All right, so 6 a.m. Mike.
Okay, Abdul, what do we have? Doris, you're on, Doris.
Hi, Mike. Hey, I've been listening to you, and I'm enjoying it a lot. I just wanted to mention there was a couple things that what you're saying. It's like yes, yes, yes about the Democrats and so on. One thing when you're mentioning about Ron, was it Wyden?
Wyden.
Was like that Wyden, the only one who seemed to ask intelligent questions. There was one person, which was a surprise, and that was Saxby Chambliss, who is from Georgia. Generally not somebody I agree with. That's why it stood out to me. He was the one who defeated Max Cleland, who lost 2 legs and an arm in Vietnam, and they turned him out to be like he was some kind of non-patriot. It was a Karl Rove deal. But anyway, Saxby Chambliss asked Brennan, do they, basically try to capture people before, killing them and so on? And Brennan, with great confidence, he looked kind of evil. He's so confident and so sure, saying, "Oh, we always go way, way out of our way to capture them." Blah blah. He says, "How many have you captured?" And his answer was like, "Well, we have captured and sent like to some other country," but that's not what he was asking. And he asked again, Saxby Chambliss, as I was surprised, said, "How many have you captured?" And he said, "I will have to get back with you on that, sir." In other words, he wasn't going to answer it. And then Saxby Chambliss said, "I would want to put in the record 1. In other words, 1 was apparently captured and the rest were killed. And on the Rachel Maddow show after that, she indicated that from 2002, 4,700 people were killed in this kinds of attacks. And if Chambliss was right, 1 of them was captured. So that idea that we try really hard to capture them, I didn't believe, and it didn't come out in that hearing. But another thing about the Democrats, and I certainly can't support the Republicans, but Dianne Feinstein, who you mentioned, when Harry Reid and they were talking about changing the filibuster, to me it's outrageous that first they don't have to stand up and talk, and that they allow that. And secondly, that someone can secretly, anonymously, have a filibuster without transparency. When it came to the changes in the filibuster, because they don't always tell you what the Dems who didn't vote the way you would like them to, they don't give you names. They say, so many didn't vote for it, but they don't tell you their names, so they kind of keep them secret. But apparently Dianne Feinstein was the one who did not want to change the filibuster, and I sent her an email about how disappointing I was, and I was utterly appalled that, as a citizen, I may not be in her district, but what she does and what those people do affect all of us because they create federal laws and so on.
Well, let me ask you a question here. First of all, as far as Saxby Chambliss goes, I think that the reason he was asking him those hard questions was just to embarrass a Democratic president. The other thing is that as far as Feinstein goes, when you send her, and I'm not discouraging this kind of behavior,
right.
But when you send her a message telling her how upset you were about what she did, what effect do you think that has on anything?
Well, I don't know. I guess I might have been ventilating, but I didn't want her to think that it went on, that somebody didn't notice it. And that because she's a Democrat, that there are people out there who don't automatically accept what the Democrats did and who don't necessarily, a lot of them don't find out what they did. And I just wanted them to know that I recognized she had done that and that was a
Well, I think that was probably a good thing to do, and it probably made you feel better. And I think it probably was a good thing to do. However, what I would say is that if people keep voting for them, when they keep acting like whores, prostitutes, and pigs, if people keep voting for them, then they don't have to pay any attention to what anybody says after they get elected.
Exactly.
Don't vote for them.
Right, well, I agree with you on that, and that means too you got to work with people to change the vote. But another thing that came up was, the issue with the U.S. Post Office.
Right.
How it's basically trying to. Okay, I started hearing about that one, and I thought, what the heck is that all about? And I called the U.S. Library of Congress, and I wanted to find out who the heck voted for that and who didn't, who voted against it. And I was kind of surprised when the librarian told me, you won't be able to find that out. And I said, well, why not? She said it wasn't a roll call vote. It was a yay or nay vote. And I thought to myself, as I understand it, any member can say, I want a roll call vote, correct?
Right.
Can call for a roll call
That's right.
vote. But nobody did. And so that means they all were compliant in that. They were all compliant when nobody called for a roll. If the Dems are...
Oh, well, not one of them wants to go down on the record as having squashed Saturday mail delivery. You know what that's all about? This has been going on for many years now. And I've had people from the Postal Union, Postal, Deliverers Union on here to talk about this. What's going on here is clearly a case of privatization, right? This is more privatization. What's happening is Congress is at fault here. They could have, for many, many years now, they could have fixed the problem by passing a bill. It's complicated, but it has to do with guaranteeing pensions for people who haven't even been hired yet. In other words, they went so far out of their way to guarantee pensions, and this is part of a whole setup. The bottom line is that Congress is responsible for what will ultimately be the privatization of the post office. And that's what this is all about. They want to close the whole post office down as a government program and let FedEx or UPS operate it. And you can damn well know that they will not deliver to where you are because it's not convenient or profitable to them. And they will not deliver to where you are or at all unless you pay them 5 times as much as you're paying now. And the other thing about this is, and this is Congress's fault, right? Because they're bribed by private interests. And the other thing about this is that they are not going to run at a loss because they always have to balance the budget. This is bullshit. This is nonsense. There are some things that you do for the sake of the American people, even if it does run at a loss, and you get your money back from the rich people, which this administration won't do.
Right. I agree. And the thing about the post office is they were able to take care of their expenses. They don't take any tax dollars. A lot of people don't know that. But so they take an efficient government agency, which they don't like to admit exists, and actually make it so that it can't meet its needs.
That's right.
And both parties participated in that.
Just wait. Within 3 to 5 years, UPS or some other organization like that is going to wind up running the post office, and we'll get our mail if we pay them $10 each for each delivery.
You think people will get angry at some point?
No. Americans have gotten over being angry. They just watch TV.
You're right. They watch. Well, I mean, I can't give up because
No. I don't want anybody to give up, and I'm not giving up. I'm just stating what I see.
I understand. I agree that's the way it is, and so a lot of people have to work to try to talk to people, and I do that. And when I talk to people, I'm surprised at fairly intelligent people who don't know these things. But no, not everybody can watch the TV, listen to that. I can't either. I do it in between working 10 hours a day. But they're not getting the information.
My point of view is that every time somebody puts a new app on their device, which crosses party lines, color lines, and intelligence lines, anytime somebody puts a new app on their device, they kill 4,000 brain cells.
They do what?
They destroy 4,000 brain cells.
Oh.
I think people are apping themselves to death. You know the word apathy?
Yeah.
I think it's related to apps. Okay, thanks, man.
Thank you. Uh-huh.
Okay, bye. One more call. Who do we have? What's that? Mitchell, my old pal. You have 2 minutes before your time expires.
Comrade Fader, good evening.
Don't start with me.
I know I'm a disappointment to you, but I love you anyway. Listen, well, first of all, I also wrote to my senators on that filibuster thing, too. And I wrote to Harry Reid, too, and I said he should be stepped down as leader. I don't know what good it'll do. But
did he write back to you apologizing?
No, but I did ask for a response from the New Jersey senators.
Okay.
So we'll see what happens. Anyway, and also on the payroll tax, I have to disagree with you over there. If we are going to argue that Social Security should be left alone because it is funded through our tax deductions of FICA payments, we can't in the next breath say that we can eliminate the FICA payments and not put the tax in jeopardy. And I would argue.
But wait, what about raising the cap on it? Which would bring in the amount of money that's needed to keep the thing going in perpetuity, and they wouldn't have to reinstate this 2% tax on the rest of us.
That's more of an argument that we could engage in. I need to see more numbers with that. I would probably be more in agreement with that. But as far as the tax itself goes, even people like Bernie Sanders voted against that tax when it was first introduced because he felt that it would put the program potentially in jeopardy, which is basically what they had done during the Bush administration, not funding what they were doing. But I really want to talk about what your main topic was tonight, which was the military and these actions. And what I would say is this. When you look at government, I know you distrust government. I don't necessarily trust it or distrust it. I just kind of look at it as an institution. And I don't look at you look at the people who are behind that institution and think, well, why aren't they responding in that way? And I'm looking at the institution and as it relates as a top-down structure that the people who are involved with government have to respond to. So there's only going to be incremental shifts in that. And I'll give you like an analogy. Like if you had like a corporation.
Really, there's only about a minute and a half. But go ahead. Yeah.
Let's say you had a corporation like Apple, okay? And you had Steve Jobs as the visionary, the founder or whatever, the philosopher, and he's the energy behind it, whatever. Eventually, his corporation is so big that there are so many issues. There's issues of production. There's issues of labor practices. There are issues, how do they affect the environment with what they're producing? These things go beyond Steve Jobs. These things go beyond Obama, beyond any senator or anything else. If you put Noam Chomsky as president, he would have to capitulate to some of the practices of the institution also. Let me ask you a question, though. What would you do? You're President Fader, and you get intelligence that there's going to be an imminent attack on the United States, and you have to you suppose you should take some action to prevent it. What do you do?
I need a few more details. What do you mean by imminent attack?
You have absolutely positive intelligence that there's going to be that there's people plotting an attack against the United States. You know the date, you know the time, you know the logistics. You could disrupt it through military action, or you could do nothing, and the attack will more than likely happen. What do you do?
I think in that particular instance, I would probably authorize the military or Mr. Brennan and his secret underground murderers to probably kill those people. And at the same time, I would be but then I wouldn't be like the president now or other presidents. I would be taking massive steps at the same time to figure out other ways for us to engage with other countries besides pounding them over the head when we don't like them.
But if it was an imminent attack, you don't have enough time for all that. I'm not saying
their idea of an imminent attack and my idea of an imminent attack and who the targets are vastly different.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
that's all.
It will depend on the particulars. But what my point to you,
real quick, you got 30 seconds.
Okay. There should be a methodology in place to review all of these pre-attack scenarios or whatever. There should be a review of that before these things happen. I mean, if you